Hey, Carsten, I was wondering, is the chat questions, will they be summarized and added into some report, or have we handled properly all the questions in the chat?
You are not obliged to sit and write things in the report. I mean, it's since there are so many people now, we know some of them are on the YouTube channel, but since there are so many, you can only answer what is possible and what the time allows. So no, there is no specific requirements with regard to these questions. We just do the best under these circumstances. It's difficult with so many people.
But I mean, the team, we have a way to collect all the questions separately.
I know now. I was not here Monday, so I don't know how you did, but there was a time where you should, where it was possible to discuss, as far as I remember from this program. And at that time, something may be in the chat, questions in the chat. Hopefully, Mita, she will help me a bit, or you will help them on this, because they are quite often in Bahasa, these questions.
Yeah, a few of them, yeah.
So we should not be discriminatory so that we only take English questions. We should take them all.
No, I've been using Google Translate.
Oh, yeah,
at the same time. Yeah, I got two questions like this. Actually, there are some very good questions. It's interesting. But my concern is, have we got all the questions addressed, answered, or not? I could not follow all after it went too fast.
I can imagine it will be difficult with such a big, I mean, so many people. So do our best. Hopefully we'll find the most important questions, or you will find the most important questions.
Yeah, agree.
Afternoon, Siti.
Hi, Carsten. Hi, Prof. Dedi.
Hello.
Hi, Khalid. Hello, Mbak Mita. I think it's time to start. It's already yes, it's already 1 p.m. Thank you.
Mita, please.
Okay. Thank you. Selamat siang, Bapak dan Ibu, peserta workshop Food Standards and Food Regulation. Terima kasih telah hadir pada hari kedua ini. Pada sebelumnya, kemarin lusa ya, tanggal 16, kita sudah mendengarkan dari opening dari Pak Wahyu, Carsten, Prof. Dedi, dan materi dari Prof. Dedi dan Mr. Allen. Hari ini kita akan melanjutkan materi lebih banyak mengenai Codex Alimentarius, dan mungkin kita langsung saja ya Bapak Ibu dengan paparan pertama. Dipersilahkan kepada Prof. Dedi terlebih dahulu. Silakan.
Baik, terima kasih Mbak Widi. Hello everybody. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good afternoon. So I will be the first to present Codex material. So I will share the screen now. Please wait for a while. Can you see it?
Yes, it's clear.
Yes.
Prof. Dedi, we have translation. You can speak in Bahasa if you want to.
Yeah, I will. Okay. So I will explain about the Codex Alimentarius Commission. Status, sejarah sedikit, kemudian prinsip-prinsip bagaimana Codex menyusun standar. Itu yang penting mungkin. Baik, pertama ini saya memperlihatkan. Ini adalah laporan pertama, the first report Codex 1963. So it means that it's already 58 years Codex. This is the first report. But now we have the new one. Codex Alimentarius Commission Procedural Manual, which is the basic principle is there. So I would like also to explain a little bit about the status of the Codex. So first is, what is Codex actually? Before I explain Codex, so I think it's important that we have a we call the three sisters under the SPS agreement, under the WTO agreement. We have OIE, which is discussing about animal health, IPPC, plant health, and Codex, of course, human health, food safety. So these three organizations is actually talking about the maintaining the life, the health of animals, plant, and human. So it become the principle that used by the WTO in terms of trade facilitation. Okay, Codex is actually the intergovernmental body of the United Nations. They have now 188 members countries plus one member organization of European Union. So it become 189 member actually. The main function is to adopt science-based standards. So we have the specific term, science-based standards. So the standards developed based on the risk assessment and based on the science. The mandate, of course, very specific, safety of health of consumers. That's the first one. And the second one, very important in the trade, which is the Codex used as a vehicle or maybe a standard for fair practice in food trade to facilitate food trade. So the process of developing standard is inclusive. So that's why we can follow the Codex procedure manual if you would like to have the the process in detail about how to develop the standard by Codex. So this is the distribution of the members. Actually, it covers around 99% of the world population. So it becomes very important that the adoption of the standard will be important for the whole world actually. Actually, Codex unites the multiple partners. So when develop the standard, they also discuss in the forum attended by multiple partners like from governments, ministries, governments, Codex Secretariat, FAO, WHO, including also non-government organization in a common project to protect the health of consumer. Again, it's very important to protect the health of consumer and to ensure the fair practice in the food trade. So when they develop the standard, they promote coordination actually of all food standard work undertaken by international governments, organization and international non-government organization as well. So actually the Codex is developing and maintaining a collection of international food standard. They call this Codex Alimentarius. How to process and what result from Codex work. Actually, Codex is kind of exchange of information, okay, regarding the standard and the following standard. And also Codex is an internal forum to negotiate and define standards. So this is really forum for consensus actually in developing the standard. Very important that actually Codex standards are not obligatory and each country decide to how to apply them. So it doesn't mean that Codex is mandatory for the members of the member country, but actually each country have to decide how to apply them. But also it's very important, Codex standard by themselves do not guarantee food safety because you need an effective control system in place if you like to improve or increase the food safety in the country. I will not read this statutes because I already mentioned about the Codex work previously. So I just continue with the next information, which is talking about general principles of the Codex Alimentarius. I forgot. Maybe I have to explain in Bahasa Indonesia. Okay, I will continue with Bahasa Indonesia. Jadi tujuan daripada Codex actually itu salah satu yang penting adalah bahwa Codex itu adalah merupakan suatu kumpulan dari standar yang diadopsi secara internasional. Dan yang penting adalah bahwa dipresentasikan, disusun dalam suatu bentuk yang uniform. Nah, ini penting. Uniform mengapa? Karena memang dalam perjalanannya Codex itu selalu melakukan revisi macam-macam. Dengan demikian, kalau formatnya uniform, mudah sekali dilakukan revisi tersebut. Dan sudah tentu diulang-ulang ini. Saya tadi mengulang ini bahwa tujuan daripada standar tersebut dan related text itu termasuk juga code of practice dan guideline ya. Itu tujuannya selalu diulang-ulang untuk melindungi kesehatan konsumen dan untuk menjamin perdagangan yang adil, perdagangan pangan yang adil. Jadi selalu dua itu selalu dibawa-bawa untuk kesehatan konsumen dan untuk perdagangan. Ya. Jadi di samping itu juga dengan adanya kodeks standar itu juga digunakan untuk membantu melakukan harmonisasi di antara negara-negara yang berkecimpung di dalam perdagangan tersebut. Dalam rangka juga memfasilitasi perdagangan internasional tersebut. Skopnya, nah ini saya kira penting juga diketahui bahwa skopnya itu adalah standar untuk pangan semuanya, baik itu olahan, proses, semi olahan, semi proses, dan mentah. Jadi semuanya disusun standarnya oleh Codex, dan penting lagi bahwa itu untuk distribusi kepada konsumen. Nah sudah tentu distribusi berarti peredaran, berarti juga terkait dengan perdagangan. Makanya Codex itu selalu mengatakan tujuannya adalah melindungi kesehatan konsumen dan melindungi dan memfasilitasi perdagangan yang adil. Nah, apa yang diatur dalam Codex atau dikembangkan standarnya dalam Codex itu sangat spesifik dan saya kira saya sudah menjelaskannya waktu kemarin 2 hari yang lalu terkait dengan regulatory framework di Indonesia. Jelas sekali bahwa yang diatur atau dikembangkan standarnya adalah food hygiene, ya, food hygiene. Terkait kemarin dulu saya menjelaskan food hygiene terkait dengan food practices, sanitation terutama, di sini food sanitation. Kemudian sangat spesifik food additives, banyak sekali food additive yang dikaji oleh Codex, kemudian diatur peraturannya karena food additive adalah sesuatu yang ditambahkan dengan sengaja, makanya diatur betul oleh Codex bagaimana cara menggunakannya. Kemudian yang diatur lagi adalah residu pestisida dan residu obat hewan. Nah, dalam Codex yang disebut residu itu hanya untuk residu pestisida dan obat hewan. Jadi kontaminan itu bukan residu. Kontaminan adalah satu kriteria tersendiri. Kontaminan itu seperti misalkan saja mungkin logam berat, MCPD dan macam-macam. Tapi residu hanya untuk pestisida dan obat hewan. Kemudian juga yang diatur adalah label dan iklan, labeling and presentation method. Presentation ya. Kemudian juga metode analisis dan sampling itu juga dibahas di dalam Codex. Dan sudah tentu yang terakhir adalah import and export inspection and certification karena itu terkait dengan perdagangan tadi. Nah, itulah poin-poin yang dibahas secara detail dalam Codex, kemudian dibuat peraturannya, dibuat standarnya, termasuk juga dibuat guideline pedoman dan termasuk juga code of practice. Itu adalah produk-produk yang dihasilkan oleh Codex. Tadi saya sudah menyampaikan ini Codex bukan standar, bukan untuk substitusi ya atau alternatif bagi suatu negara, tapi ini adalah sebagai benchmark yang kemudian masing-masing negara akan menyusun regulasi tersebut tersendiri dengan mengacu kepada Codex sebagai benchmark tadi. Saya tidak akan membaca ini karena ini terkait selalu dikatakan bahwa menjamin kesehatan konsumen, kemudian juga dilabel secara benar dan sebagainya. Nah, tadi dikatakan bahwa standar Codex itu dibuat disusun dalam satu bentuk yang standar, uniform. Ini contohnya. Ini adalah format dari Codex standar komoditi, Codex komoditi standar. Saya sudah menjelaskan ini pada bagian luar yang lalu, regulatory framework di Indonesia, dan ini adalah yang juga diadopsi standar format ini, standar nasional Indonesia (SNI). Jadi selalu ada nama standar, skopnya apa, deskripsi, kemudian komposisi yang penting, dan kemudian faktor-faktor yang terkait dengan kualitas. Nah, selalu ada, tadi saya katakan ada food additive, selalu ada, kontaminan selalu ada, hygiene selalu ada, labeling selalu ada, dan method of analysis and sampling selalu ada. Saya mengatakan itu karena memang tadi disebutkan sebelumnya bahwa yang dibilang hygiene, food additive, kontaminan, residu mungkin terkait di dalamnya. Ya. Kemudian metode analisis juga disebutkan. Oke, nah dalam menyusun itu, Codex pun kemudian membuat standar-standar guideline yang umum. Contohnya misalkan saja pada saat bicara food additive, maka mereka merefer kepada general standard. Indonesia pun sama. Indonesia kalau Badan POM mau menyusun standar, acuannya adalah GSFP ini. Ya. Formatnya juga diikuti dari GSFP, sama seperti juga yang lain-lain. Kontaminan juga ada pedomannya yang harus diacu, yaitu JSCTF, General Standard for Contaminant and Toxin in Food. Kemudian juga untuk hygiene ada lagi khusus di sini, ini terkait dengan microbiological sebetulnya, terkait dengan cemaran-cemaran mikrobiologi. Kalau kemudian di sini terkait dengan microbiological standard. Jadi diacu adalah General Principle of Food Hygiene and the Principle of the Establishment of Application of Microbial Criteria for Food. Nah, dilakukan di sini sangat ketat di sini tentang kuantitas yaitu mengacu kepada General Standard for Labeling Prepackaged Food. Ini ada reference-nya. Kemudian tadi saya mengatakan juga metode of analysis and sampling. Jadi semua itu sudah mengacu kepada suatu general standard tertentu. Ya. Jadi nanti hadirin yang ingin meneliti lebih dalam, ini bisa di-download gratis. Semua Codex itu luar biasa. Semua informasi bisa di-download gratis dan mudah sekali, cepat sekali downloadnya. Jadi sangat penting bisa diacu terus. Nah, dalam proses penyusunan standar itu panjang, cukup panjang, bisa bertahun-tahun, tergantung daripada diskusinya, tergantung pada konsensusnya. Saya tidak akan menjelaskan bagaimana prosesnya. Saya kira kawan-kawan dari BSN sudah hafal betul bagaimana caranya, ya. Tapi intinya adalah bahwa kalau kita lihat di sini, karena standar itu dikembangkan dalam bentuk konsensus, ya maka sudah tentu cukup lama. Yang digambarkan di sini adalah proses-proses yang memang terkait dengan diskusi, bisa online di internet, bisa tatap muka dan sebagainya. Jadi yang merah ini adalah memulai, ya, membuat proyek dokumen, ya, yang pertama ini, ya, step pertama. Kemudian setelah itu dielaborasi menjadi hijau, ya, green di sini, ya, step pertama. Dievaluasi, dielaborasi, kemudian baru disusun standarnya. Nah, kalau kita lihat di sini cukup panjang karena ada step yang berikutnya yang kemudian memberikan komen, dibahas komennya, kemudian dikembalikan komennya. Itu proses-proses yang cukup panjang, ya. Karena akhirnya memang ada konsensus. Sehingga dengan demikian, dengan konsensus tersebut ada konklusi sudah tentu. Ada persetujuan, kemudian dibuatlah teks dan akhirnya kemudian dibicarakan kembali sehingga pada suatu saat akan diadopsi dalam suatu sidang Codex Alimentarius Commission yang dilakukan setiap tahun secara bergantian di Roma sebagai headquarters negara dari FAO dan kemudian di Jenewa karena ada WHO. Jadi bergantian mereka. Itulah prosesnya, dan ini cukup lama, tergantung daripada sudah tentu standarnya. Nah, apa yang dihasilkan kodeks? Ini yang penting mungkin kita ketahui. Pertama adalah standar. Saya dari awal, sejak sejak 2 hari yang lalu, selalu mengatakan horizontal standar. Saya berikan contohnya juga, misalkan horizontal standar untuk kontaminan, aditif, ya. Ini adalah standar yang disusun, kemudian bisa diterapkan untuk banyak komoditi. Jadi yang disusun standarnya, standar aditifnya atau kontaminannya, kemudian diatur untuk banyak komoditi. Ya. Ini GSFI ini adalah bahan taman pangan, aditif. GSTF ini adalah kontaminan, juga labeling juga diatur, itu sebagai bagian dari horizontal standar. Metode juga sama. Nah, kemudian saya juga menyampaikan di situ kepada yang lalu ada produk standar, atau saya mengatakan horizontal standar, karena kalau ada vertical standar, karena kalau ada horizontal pasti ada vertikal. Nah, ini produk standar ini adalah vertikal, yaitu sangat spesifik untuk suatu produk atau komoditi standar. Kemudian yang dihasilkan juga oleh Codex adalah guideline. Guidelines ini terkait dengan prinsip-prinsip, mungkin penyusunan standar, bagaimana sertifikasi, bagaimana guideline untuk inspection, bagaimana guideline untuk melakukan risk analysis, guideline untuk sampling. Ya. Jadi ini adalah satu produk yang sangat penting. Ya. Kemudian ada code of practice. Kalau diterjemahkan di Indonesia mungkin ini adalah good practices, cara budidaya yang baik, cara handling yang baik, cara GMP, cara produksi pangan yang baik, cara transportasi yang baik. Jadi semua ada good practices di sini. Ya. Ini intinya di dalam good practices, sebagaimana saya juga menyampaikan sebelumnya, itu terkait dengan food sanitation, terkait dengan hygiene. Intinya adalah untuk mencegah terjadinya kontaminasi kepada produk yang sedang diproses. Jadi, kemudian sudah tentu ada lagi yang dikembangkan maksimum level pestisida, ya, kemudian obat hewan. Nah, kemudian ada standar regional yang kemudian dikembangkan juga karena memang mereka juga punya Codex Committee terkait dengan regional. Nah, kalau kita lihat memang sangat spesifik. Pertama adalah standar, bisa horizontal maupun vertikal. Ya. Yang vertikal itu adalah standar komoditi. Kemudian guideline, ini sangat penting. Ya. Guideline bisa juga dikembangkan, bukan hanya prinsip-prinsip seperti ini, tapi juga guideline kalau misalkan dalam suatu analisis dibutuhkan suatu guideline. Misalkan saja guideline untuk bagaimana melakukan proses agar supaya terhindar dari aflatoksin, misalkan saja. Itu juga guideline. Disusun di sana. Code of practice juga. Jadi penting sekali kalau kita mau mengetahui terkait dengan yang dibutuhkan oleh pelaku usaha, misalkan saja, download saja ini dari Codex gratis, dan itu sangat penting dan sangat tepat karena semua guideline, code of practice, standar itu disusun secara saintifik dan mudah sekali untuk di-download. Jadi saya persilakan, janganlah segan-segan download saya sebanyak mungkin informasinya karena penting untuk perdagangan kita, untuk pelaku usaha untuk melakukan perdagangan. Ini contoh aja, secara singkat aja, ini horizontal standar, ya standar yang kemudian diaplikasikan untuk banyak komoditi. Yes, ini untuk kontaminan, ini untuk hygiene, ini untuk labeling, ini untuk nutrition labeling juga ada, kemudian untuk maksimum residu lindung. Nah, ini kemudian dijadikan dasar untuk pengembangan. Jadi ini digunakan, informasi ini digunakan justru untuk mengembangkan produk standar. Jadi mengacu ke sini, kemudian disusunlah produk standar. Additive. Nah, ini yang baru-baru ini ya. Sekarang sudah ada tahun 2020, sekarang sudah ada Code of Practice untuk alergen ya. Jadi bagi para pengusaha yang kemudian mengetahui bahwa di Indonesia juga sudah mulai diatur alergen dalam labeling, maka ini ada Code of Practice-nya, bisa diacu ya. Ini ada standar untuk fermented cook cassava based product. Nah, ini juga saya baru mengetahui kalau ada sini ada ini mungkin ini apa ya, peyem apa ya ini. Saya nggak tahu ya, tapi ini adalah fermented cook cassava coba. Jadi sudah ada, masih baru. Ini facelift genetum, saya nggak tahu ini genetum genom atau mungkin ini daun apa ya, tangkil apa ya. Ini juga sangat spesifik ya. Jadi sekarang sudah banyak produk-produk tradisional yang diusulkan oleh banyak negara untuk dijadikan standar di sini. Ada fresh garlic, ada kiwi fruit dan seterusnya. Ini contoh yang baru-baru ya, relatif baru. Nah ini contoh standar yang ada di Codex dan saya kira mudah di-download, sangat banyak sekali. Dan ini adalah listnya, saya tidak akan bacakan, tapi ini adalah standar yang terkait sudah tentu dengan komoditi standar, ya, produk standar. Ada salmon kaleng, ada madu, ada apple sauce kaleng, dan banyak lagi. Dan ini kalau standar ada kodenya CXS di sini standar di sini. Kemudian yang mengeluarkan ini ada komitinya, kan? Codex Committee on Food Labeling. Misalkan di sini terkait dengan labeling. Ada lagi Codex Committee on apa ya? Ini mungkin fish product sini dan sebagainya. Dan kemudian bisa di-download, bisa dalam bahasa Inggris dan bahasa yang lainnya. Kecuali bahasa Indonesia nggak ada. Tapi bahasa Inggris ada, tinggal di-download di situ. Ini standar, ini guideline, tadi saya menyampaikan, banyak sekali guideline di sini yang bisa kita gunakan untuk membantu para pengusaha pangan dalam mengembangkan produknya. Ya. Ada guideline untuk klaim, ada labeling, dan sebagainya. Ya. Saya akan terus saja. Dan ini adalah kode practice-nya. Kode practice bagaimana melakukan good practices, misalkan di sini, bagaimana kode practice untuk mengalengkan buah-buahan dan sebagainya. Jadi semua itu sangat penting dan informasi itu luar biasa. Kita kaya informasi, jadi kita kalau tidak memanfaatkan kita rugi. Ya. Jadi itu penting untuk di-download dan dipelajari. Banyak sekali, bisa dipilih. Nah ini hanya untuk menjelaskan saja bagaimana organisasi Codex ini. Ada Codex Alimentarius Commission yang nanti akan membuat mengetok palu kalau sudah standarnya dibicarakan ya secara konsensus, mengetok palu setiap tahun di Roma atau di Jenewa untuk dijadikan standar resmi dari Codex. Nah ini komite-komite yang tadi saya sudah menyampaikan, ada komite yang bergerak di bidang kontaminan di pangan, kemudian aditif, hygiene, labeling, dan seterusnya. Saya tidak akan bacakan, tapi inilah komite-komite khusus yang sifatnya dia menyusun standar. Misalkan saja mengatur maksimum level dari suatu kontaminan atau aditif atau residu dan sebagainya. Ada sekretariat dan kemudian ada lagi komite-komite lainnya yang pendukung. Ada komite yang sangat spesifik adalah komite komoditi seperti minyak dan lemak, ada perikanan, ada fruit, vegetables, ada spices. Nah ini spices herbal ini relatif baru. Ya ini kalau tidak salah India dulu yang mengusulkan di sini, huruf di sana banyak ya. Kalau tidak salah waktu presidennya Codex dari India ya. Kemudian ada lagi kalau ini komoditi bisa selesai. Dulu banyak sekali ada komite untuk yang milk dan macam-macam ya. Tapi kalau sudah selesai tugasnya selesai. Ini yang sekarang masih berkembang adalah ad hoc untuk antimicrobial resistant. Karena ini sangat penting sekali dan ini terus bergerak karena sangat penting. Dan kemudian ada lagi komite-komite yang berbasis dari wilayah negara, benua di sini ya, Afrika, Asia dan sebagainya. Dan ini dimanfaatkan oleh masing-masing anggota Codex untuk menjadi wahana diskusi sebelum mereka mengusulkan di sidang Codex. Karena perlu ada lobby-lobby di antara kelompok ini agar supaya nanti bisa didukung dalam pembicaraan atau sidang-sidang di Codex. Itu kelompoknya dan saya kira jelas bahwa dengan ini ujungnya adalah membuat standar. Jadi General Subject Committee nanti akan membuat standar tersebut. Nah sekarang bagaimana? Yang penting adalah bagaimana menyusun standar tersebut ya sampai diadopsi. Ini penting. Basic principle dalam menyusun standar adalah berdasarkan analisis risiko. Dan Codex sudah mengembangkan ada 3 komponen analisis risiko yang digunakan, yaitu pengkajian risiko, ya, risk assessment, manajemen risiko, dan komunikasi risiko. Semuanya itu tujuannya adalah untuk mengembangkan atau mengestimasi sebetulnya, mengestimasi risiko terhadap kesehatan manusia. Jadi kalau risiko itu kan probability, yaitu yang kemudian dikaji berdasarkan kaidah-kaidah saintifik. Pertama, mengidentifikasi bahaya, kemudian mengkarakterisasi bahaya, dan kemudian menghitung berapa paparannya, exposure assessment, baru kemudian mengkarakterisasi risikonya. Itu yang kemudian dikembangkan oleh Codex, sehingga menjadi standar. Dan sudah tentu kalau sudah ada estimasi risiko, maka itu kemudian bagaimana di measures, mitigasi, di manage. Nah, salah satu manajemen dari risiko ini adalah dengan menyusun standar tadi. Menyusun standar adalah bagian dari risk management. Nah, sudah tentu penting untuk selalu berkomunikasi dengan stakeholders, ya. Tim ini, di antara tim berkomunikasi, dan sudah tentu juga berkomunikasi dengan industri, pihak industri, konsumen, dan sebagainya. Itu prinsipnya, jadi melalui kaidah-kaidah risk analysis. Nah, untuk lebih memperjelas siapa yang melakukan itu, ini adalah karakterisasi dari hazard, dari bahaya yang dibicarakan oleh Codex. Pertama, hazardnya apa? Tadi kita sudah bicara di depan bahwa Codex itu mengatur food additive, ya. Jadi yang dibahas di sini dikaji adalah food additive. Apalagi residu apa? Residu pestisida, residu obat hewan. Jadi itu juga yang diacu di sini untuk dikembangkan sebagai standar, ya. Apalagi kontaminan apa? Heavy metal, termasuk mycotoxin. Dan sudah tentu bahaya mikroba. Nah, untuk mengkaji ini sudah tentu ada tim. Tim itu adalah tim pengkaji atau risk assessor. Risk assessor-nya adalah tim scientific team, yaitu seperti JECFA. JECFA ini adalah Joint Expert Committee on Food Additive. Nah, JECFA inilah yang kemudian mengkaji risiko dari bahan tambahan pangan atau aditif, termasuk juga dari kontaminan, termasuk juga dari obat hewan. Itu JECFA yang mengkaji. Jadi mengkaji seberapa bahaya sih itu, kemudian bagaimana safety margin daripada bahaya tersebut. Nah, kalau GMPR jelas ini kaitannya khusus untuk mengkaji residu pestisida, ya. Jadi semua ini dikerjakan secara saintifik. Mereka ini expert-expert yang berasal dari negara-negara anggota Codex. Bergabung, kemudian melakukan kajian-kajian secara saintifik. Mengikuti suatu kaidah-kaidah yang sangat baku, format risk assessment atau risk analysis. Dan kemudian JECFA juga mengkaji di sini kontaminan, heavy metal, mycotoxin, atau yang lain, sudah tentu, ya. Kemudian JEMRA ini spesifik untuk mikrobiologi, ya, melakukan assessment di sini, kemudian melakukan kajian-kajian secara kuantitatif, menghitung dose respons, dan kemudian juga menghitung infective dose, ya, sehingga dengan demikian bisa juga menentukan food safety objective, yaitu apa ya? Food safety objective adalah jumlah daripada load mikroba yang ditemukan pada saat kita konsumsi, yang kemudian tidak memberikan dampak kesehatan. Jadi itu dihitung. Itu target utama dari kita memproses dan untuk mencapai food safety objective, yang kemudian dengan FSO ini akan menjadi kontribusi, akan memberikan kontribusi terhadap ALOP, appropriate level of protection. Nah, itu kira-kira pengkajinya ini, kemudian dari pengkaji ini kemudian memberikan data kepada Codex Committee. Nah, ini sekedar saja singkat aja bahwa mereka melakukan kajian-kajian dose response, sudah tentu penting bagaimana menyusun EDI, ya, dengan memberikan pengukuran melewati animal assay. Saya singkat aja di sini, intinya adalah bahwa EDI ditentukan untuk bahan tambahan pangan, kemudian juga untuk residu, ya, itu EDI, ya. Tapi kalau yang lain TDI untuk kontaminan. Jadi untuk manusia seperti ini. Nah, ini contohnya mengapa disusun. Jadi mereka menyusun safety margin, ya, untuk proteksi konsumen, yaitu bahwa ada batasnya untuk residu pestisida, ya. Jadi EDI adalah sejumlah atau jumlah dari aditif atau kontaminan, aditif, ya, yang dinyatakan dalam berat badan per hari, ya, yang jika dikonsumsi setiap hari seumur hidup itu tidak memberikan risiko, ya. Jadi itu batasnya. Dengan demikian maka jika konsumsi aditif itu lebih rendah daripada EDI, maka itu aman-aman saja. Kalau TDI adalah tolerable daily intake untuk kontaminan, definisinya mirip, tapi ini diterapkan untuk kontaminan. Istilahnya sama, istilahnya sebetulnya definisinya sama, tapi istilahnya berbeda. Tolerable diterapkan untuk kontaminan, acceptable diterapkan untuk aditif. Mengapa? Karena aditif ditambahkan dengan sengaja. Jadi istilahnya acceptable. Tapi kalau kontaminan kan tidak sengaja ada dalam pangan. Sehingga dengan demikian istilah menjadi tolerable. Dan kemudian untuk mikrobiological kita dihitung infective dose, sehingga jika ada konsumsi di bawah di sebelah kiri dari garis merah ini itu masih aman. Jika ada konsumsi di sebelah kanan dari merah ini berarti dia sudah berisiko. Harus dilakukan tindakan manajemen, termasuk juga mengatur standar. Nah, inilah kemudian data ini dipakai oleh manajer, ya, di sini Codex Committee untuk menyusun maksimum levelnya dari aditif maupun kontaminan, kemudian juga menyusun MRL untuk residu, kemudian menyusun untuk food safety objective. Nah, standar yang sudah ada biasanya direview kembali, gitu ya, apakah memang hasil kajian tersebut, paparan tersebut itu nanti ada di bawah safety margin ini, di bawah EDI atau di bawah TDI atau di atasnya. Kalau dari kajian-kajian risiko itu menemukan bahwa itu masih di bawah EDI, maka regulasi tersebut masih bisa melindungi konsumen. Tapi kalau sudah di atas EDI, jadi itu harus ada review, harus ada revisi. Nah, itulah kemudian yang dilakukan secara rutin oleh masing-masing negara anggota Codex untuk melakukan kajian apakah standarnya sudah masih bisa melindungi konsumen atau belum. Ini prinsipnya saja. Jadi ada risk assessment, kemudian ditentukan tadi saya mengatakan ada EDI, TDI. Data ini kemudian diberikan kepada manajemen risiko, ya di sini maksimum level ditentukan di sini. Kemudian jika tidak ada EDI maka istilahnya EDI not specified, maka standarnya adalah GMP. Kemudian ada juga untuk residu. Oke, nah inilah prosesnya. Kalau di Codex seperti ini prosesnya. Jadi ada Codex Committee itu sebagai bagian atau berlaku sebagai risk managers yang kemudian menyusun maksimum level tadi saya katakan. Datanya diberikan oleh risk assessor dari JEMRA, JECVA, JMPR itu mengkaji risikonya. Kemudian kalau terkait dengan kimia maka yang ditetapkan EDI salah satunya untuk bahan taman pangan atau residu pestisida atau TDI untuk kontaminan. Kemudian dari situ dihitung paparannya, dihitung exposure-nya, dan kemudian nanti setelah itu baru kemudian dibuat standarnya oleh Codex Committee ini. Jadi kita baru bisa menyusun berapa maksimum level yang diizinkan itu kalau sudah dihitung paparannya. Tanpa menghitung paparan tidak mungkin kita menyusun standar maksimum level yang bisa yang terdapat pada panel. Ini prosesnya, ya. Jadi saya kira jelas ada risk assessor, ada risk manager di Codex. Dan ini pun di masing-masing negara dilakukan. Seperti di Indonesia ada juga tim yang dari risk assessor. Kalau di Indonesia ada namanya INARAC, Indonesia Risk Assessment Center. Kemudian datanya diberikan kepada masing-masing manajer risiko di masing-masing kementerian terkait. Nah, ini prinsipnya saja. Jadi kalau kembali kepada 3 komponen risk analysis itu berbasis ilmiah, yang dilakukan adalah mengidentifikasi hazard, mengkarakterisasi hazard, ya, kemudian menghitung exposure assessment-nya, dan kemudian mengkarakterisasi risikonya. Kemudian data ini nanti akan diberikan kepada risk manager di Codex itu adalah Codex Committee. Nah, data ini kemudian didiskusikan, dan ini yang saya berikan panah ini adalah traffic daripada data. Di sebelah kanan ada data EDI, ada data TDI, ada data juga microbial risk assessment data, kemudian diberikan kepada manajer untuk dibuat standar. Itu proses-proses yang terjadi di Codex. Nah, kalau dikaitkan dengan kesemuanya, ini mungkin yang penting saya kaitkan dengan WTO karena sangat penting Codex sebagai benchmark bagi WTO seperti ini kira-kira. Jadi selalu ada agreement di antara member country dengan WTO, ya, SPS agreement, di mana dikatakan bahwa di situ bahwa dikaitkan dengan regulasi internasional yang harus berbasis saintifik dan berdasarkan assessment. Jadi dikatakan bahwa kalau menyusun suatu regulasi harus didasarkan atas risk assessment dan atas dasar ilmiah. Jadi kalau tidak dilakukan itu tidak bisa. Jadi kalau kita melakukannya tidak benar, nanti bisa kalah di dalam perdebatan di WTO. Tapi semua standar yang dibuat berdasarkan scientific dan assessment itu yang kemudian akan diterima. Jadi dengan demikian maka dikatakan juga di sini bahwa setiap negara boleh saja membuat tindakan atau mengatur gitu ya regulasi untuk melindungi kehidupan dan kesehatan konsumennya, ya. Tapi sudah tentu jangan asal-asalan sehingga mengganggu perdagangan. Jadi harus betul-betul atas justifikasi ilmiah. Oleh karena itulah maka dalam artikel 5 SPS Agreement itu mengatakan bahwa setiap negara menjamin SPS measures berdasarkan assessment terhadap risiko, jadi berdasarkan kajian risiko terhadap manusia, hewan dan tanaman, ya itu dasarnya. Jadi itu yang kemudian menjadi bagian yang disepakati bersama antara member country dengan WTO. Maka dengan demikian maka WTO akan menggunakan standar dari benchmark jika ada dispute di antara negara-negara anggota dalam perdagangan internasionalnya. Jadi ini prosesnya. Jadi digunakan data ini, standar ini digunakan oleh WTO jika ada masalah. Kemudian bagaimana cara menyusun standarnya? Jadi nanti manajer risiko ini adalah Codex Committee, ya, itu meminta kepada mengkaji risiko, assessor. Nah, sudah tentu berdasarkan permintaan juga dari anggota dari Codex, ya, untuk melakukan assessment, di mana kemudian risk assessor akan melakukan kajian-kajian, tadi saya sampaikan, dari mulai identifikasi bahaya, mengkarakterisasi bahaya, kemudian melakukan kajian-kajian exposure, paparan, dan sebagainya. Ya. Nah, ini adalah bagian daripada tim, dan kemudian nanti setelah dikaji, maka dia akan membutuhkan data yang kemudian ekspertisnya bisa diambil dari banyak negara, ya, karena ini adalah forum saintifik, forum ilmiah, ya. Kemudian dikaji, dan kemudian setelah dikaji diberikan scientific advice-nya kepada manajer untuk dijadikan standar. Jadi yang menyusun standar adalah risk manager ini berdasarkan data saintifik dari risk assessor, yaitu JECVA, JMPR, dan JEMRA. Nah, kemudian disusun standarnya, disusunnya standar, kemudian code of practice, disusun guideline, seperti saya sampaikan tadi, inilah produk dari Codex, standar, guideline, code of practice, dan teks lainnya diberikanlah kemudian ini, dan diadopsi oleh negara anggota. Ya, kemudian sudah tentu dibutuhkan suatu input, ya, di antara keduanya dalam rangka menyusun standar tersebut, sehingga sampai akhirnya standar tersebut diadopsi dan diketok palu setiap tahun di sidang komisi Codex. Dan sudah tentu di sini ada pertukaran informasi, dan itu kira-kira bagaimana hubungan antara Codex Committee, ya, dengan risk assessor, dengan negara anggota, dan dengan WTO. Jadi jelas sekali gambarannya bahwa itu penting sekali dalam melindungi kesehatan manusia dan juga memfasilitasi perdagangan yang adil, karena kita bicara ada WTO di sini. Nah, ini mungkin penggunaan ini nanti akan saya sampaikan setelah lain nanti menyampaikan kalahnya. Jadi saya stop dulu sampai di sini. Saya kembalikan pada Mbak Didi. So I think this is my resume, conclusion of the first presentation. So I will later will be continued by Mr. Elaine. So thank you very much. So I will stop share here now. Okay. Thank you.
Baik, terima kasih Prof. Dedi untuk paparannya. Selanjutnya akan dilanjutkan oleh Mr. Alain. Please, Mr. Alain, time is yours.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here for the second day of our workshop. And first, allow me to give heartfelt thanks to the translators who do a very good job from Indonesian to English and probably from English to Indonesian. Thank you very much. So, thank you, Professor Dedi, because your presentation is very, very comprehensive and also clear. And we know that the Codex standards are very useful for all the member states and also for all the private business operators as reference. And I will, with a few slides, I will illustrate how the Codex standards have been used in EU regulations. But first, I will go through a bit of history. Very few people know that the Codex Alimentarius started as Codex Alimentarius Europaeus, means European Codex Alimentarius. That was a proposal from Austria with the consent of all the European states in 1954 to create a specific assembly or a specific grouping to deal with food quality standards. And after the first years of working on this concept, in 1960, the FAO Regional Conference for Europe has recognized the usefulness of this assembly. And they integrated and they proposed to the FAO International Conference to adopt and to enlarge this concept. And so in the 60s, the first regional conference agreed that there should be a joint FAO World Health Organization program to develop Codex food standards. Then immediately in 1961 and 1962, the resolution number 1261 at the 11th FAO conference established the Codex Alimentarius Commission, starting from what was a European institution or committee to discuss food standard. Within a few years, it became recognized and adopted as international institution. And in 1962, this Codex Alimentarius Commission was requested to create the Codex Alimentarius itself, means the collection of standards, and accompanying joint FAO-WHO programs to develop all the tools which Professor Dedi has presented. So we see that my purpose here is that to pinpoint that from the very beginning of Codex, there has been a close cooperation between the EU and Codex Alimentarius Commission. The 21st years of work in 1965 to 1985, approximately, the commission worked. Okay, sorry. There was some echo. So in the first 20 years, the Commission work was dominated by the Western countries. And the focus was on quality standards of food, describing the food composition and etc. And the systemic guidelines and code of practices as presented earlier. And then from the 1980s, 85 to 1995, there was an increased participation in the works of Codex and the diversification with more member states joining and participating actively. And then came the recognition as one of the three sisters and the recognition and inclusion in the WTO SPS agreement. So that was really a turning point because the usefulness of the Codex standards and food safety and food quality standards in international trade was really embedded into the international trading system. Then from 1995 and to the next 10 years to 2005, there was this global forum. The Global Forum of Food Safety Regulators was created within the Codex Alimentarius Commission, and there was also more funding for developing countries. So all this gave way to a thematic diversification in the Codex work. And actually, this period at the turning of the millennium generated lots of updates and a shift in the approaches with the risk assessment, as very well explained by Professor Dedi, and other specific and systemic improvement, for example, in the conformity assessment and many others. And still the evolution is not over, of course, from 2025 to today, to this decade, we have lots of new terms and new topics coming. Food security, nutrition have came to the front of the preoccupations of the Codex Alimentarius Commission. We have the new One Health concept, which is being actively promoted by World Health Organization, but increasingly accepted within the national Codex committees and regional Codex committee. And of course, as we know all with the recent COP26, the issue on sustainability and the impact of food system on environment and climate change. So to come back to the use of Codex standards in the EU regulation, we see that after 95, there was an emphasis on risk analysis at all the levels of supervision of food, especially in the EU. Okay, and especially in the EU. Just a short reminder on the risk assessment, which is science-based, as explained earlier in much more detail. We have the specific scientific or reference committees of the Codex Alimentarius Commission, which provide a basis for the risk assessment. And then risk assessment is a policy-based action. And that's the different Codex committees who prepare standards, guidelines, or recommendations. Of course, Codex being an international entity, their purpose and the mandate of Codex is not to enforce, because risk management is understood at national level as the implementation of measures to mitigate or to prevent risk. But Codex is international, and so it provides more of an overall framework and reference and benchmarks for under the form of standards to facilitate the implementation of risk management measures in the member states. Of course, risk communication is also under the purview of Codex, and Codex does this through interactive exchange of info, ideas concerning risk. And again, this is the value of Codex is that it's an international body, so it can integrate and it can synthesize all the data and all the experience on risk communication, and it can also highlight the needs for support or the needs for new systems. And this is particularly true today with the development of IT-based and the social media approach. So on risk analysis, what was very important and relevant for the EU is the 2003 Codex Alimentarius Commission conference, and the report of this conference in the Appendix 4 state and establish the working principles for risk analysis for application in the framework of Codex Alimentarius. But of course, these principles have been taken on board in the EU food safety system. And it was very timely because we see that in the 90s, we have experienced several food crises in the EU. There was dioxin residues in chicken, poultry, meat. There was recurrent pesticides issues and a few others. And that has, of course, create alert among the EU consumers, and the Consumers Association and the governments of the member states also became more vocal in requesting EU to speed up or enhance the food safety control systems. So the EU established the independent European Food Safety Agency in 2002, based on the ongoing work of Codex on risk assessment. And of course, the EFSA, European Food Safety Agency, is independent, entirely independent of the government or of the Commission. It's funded by the European Union. The funding is written in the EU food law, so they are not depending on any policy or any political or technical body. And their job is to do the risk assessment of all hazards that could be encountered in the EU territory. So that was one first and very important legacy from the Codex, or benefit of the interaction between the EU and the Codex. Another point, of course, we have been very early adopters of the hygiene package use of HACCP in food business establishment. Again, as I explained yesterday, these dispositions, these arrangements are included in the EU food law regulation 178 of 2002, the hygiene package, the rule on general hygiene, and the rule on meat inspection as well. All these arrangements are directly, I would not say transposed, but are directly developed based on the Codex text. And at this point, I would like to make an overall comment. There is no, when you read in detail the EU regulation and the text, there is very seldom and almost never you will find a direct reference to a codex text. And nevertheless, if you go into the detail, for example, you take the HACCP, the HACCP code is described in the annex of the regulation 852 and 853. And if you read it, it's the exact wording of the Codex one. So it's just a copy, not just a copy and paste, but it's really very close to the original Codex text. But simply the reference is not mentioned. And so there are several other Codex standards that are reflected into the or fully taken into account and put into practice by the EU food safety system. Of course, the guidelines for the exchange of information between countries on rejection of import food, this has been a base for the rapid alert system for food and feed. We have the guidelines for the design, operation, assessment, and accreditation of food import and export inspection and certification system. This is also, we can say that these guidelines were reflecting what was done in the EU at the time, and the EU has further aligned and harmonized their practice across member states based on this Codex text. guideline for the development of equivalence agreement. This one, this is not a very good example, I am afraid, but while the EU strives to develop, to use these guidelines, there is no example of equivalence agreement in the area of food safety standards or food standards. So we don't have much fully developed equivalence agreement. Of course, we use these guidelines in the area of external trade, and when the EU is developing EPA with third countries as part of their external cooperation policy. And of course, the last one, the guideline for the assessment of competence of testing laboratories importing in import and export for food. This guideline, basically, it was a predecessor of the ISO 17025 standards. As you can see, the date is 1997. That was shortly before the standard was issued. So now it's a bit of dual use, but still, of course, this is taken in account in many of the EU regulation. There is a mention that, for example, in terms of accepting the result of a laboratory, the EU regulation does not require specifically that the laboratory be accredited, but they require that the laboratory should demonstrate their competence on the basis of international benchmark. And this is a reference to this guideline. What is important is that the fact that the laboratory can demonstrate they are capable of delivering results which are reliable and on a regular, on a routine basis. And that was the meaning of this guideline. Many other principles or guidelines are used in the EU regulation. Of course, Professor Dedi gave some detail on the microbiological risk assessment, and this is directly included in one of the regulations which I presented yesterday on microbiological risk in foods. The same for contaminants and toxins in food and feeds. And of course, for the labeling, again here, the EU regulation do not state and do not reference directly the Codex standards. And it is so because the Codex standards are valid for all the countries of the world. It's done by consensus. So it is a set of disposition, and the Codex standards have such content that can be accepted and useful for all the members. However, for the European Union, certain of the standards and certain of these guidelines are not sufficient because the EU has a policy, and especially since the 1995 with all this food crisis, the EU has set a very high level of consumer protection in terms of public and environmental health, and food safety is part of this. So the food policy, the food safety objectives, the policy objectives are very high. And in terms of risk management, the European Commission has decided for certain domains and for specific contaminants to go further and to have more demanding criteria and text than those of the Codex. That's why there is no or almost none reference, nominal reference to Codex text. It doesn't mean that the EU has not considered the Codex text. I would say that if you take all the regulation on food safety on the EU, 75% or 80% reflect or integrate the Codex text, but some of them go further. And that's why when you go further, you cannot reference to a specific text, because otherwise, if you put a reference but you give more higher level, it's conflicting. So the same on residue, the maximum residue limits in the EU. Yes, I would say that maybe 50 or 60% are similar to that of Codex, but some of them are higher. Food additives, I am not a specialist in food additives. Probably we will have, again, 70 to 80% of levels which are similar to Codex, maybe more. So it's very important that the cooperation between EU and, as Professor Dedi told earlier, the Codex Alimentarius Commission has 187 members, and there is only one regional bloc, regional grouping, which is a member, and the EU is a full member, in parallel to being each of the EU member states are part of the Codex, but the EU as such, as an entity, is also a member. And that's the only one. You don't have ASEAN yet, and you don't have ALENA or any other groupings. So the EU and the EU is a major actor in the field also of food science and standardization. And that's why we can say that the development of Codex standards has been influenced by EU member states. And also, of course, the EU member states and the EU experts have contributed to the development of international standards, which underpin the food law. And this is done through support on scientific matter. We have the Food Safety Agency, as I stated earlier. We have also the Joint Research Committee, which is an EU institution which is responsible for planning and developing the research program across all the topics and all the member states of the EU. So GRC is also contributing interest in food research and contributing to the advancement of scientific knowledge in this. And yeah, of course, European experts are members of the joint committees that were presented by Professor Dedi. We have also many other experts from other countries in the world. But in terms of scientific cooperation and scientific contribution, EU is also central to the Codex work. So we have also this network of food research centers, such as the Wageningen and Ghent University. We have the National Research Institute in the UK. Okay, now, since it's more like an independent and third country, but let us say we have many other groupings. And yes, as I told, this creates a community of scientists which are working both within the EU research institution and within the other joint committees, as explained earlier. We have also specific committees dedicated to food safety, the Food Safety 4.eu, which is a grouping of technical and scientific experts. We have the EFSA research platform, which is also specifically in EFSA, they have the pure research, and then you have other bodies which are developing the risk assessment process and carrying out the risk assessment process. But the research is separate from the risk assessment. There is an international panel of experts on sustainable food systems, which is more recent, and it's more related to environment and climate change than on food safety, but still interlinked. We have this Food to 2030, which is a very long-term, and it's a research program on the food system. There is a EIP, this European Innovation Platform for Agriculture, European Information and Technology on Food. These are all programs which are funded by the European Union to develop new food system or to develop or improve the way the EU is consuming and controlling the food. So in summary to this presentation, yes, of course, the EU is taking full account of international standards and has a fully developed cooperation with the Codex. Of course, EU is committed to the SPS agreement, and Article 3 says that we shall base the SPS measure on international standards. Okay, so that's taken. That's the first steps. In the EU regulation, we know and we can demonstrate that all the key principles recommended by the Codex are always taken into account. The regulatory work, the preparation of the EU regulation is largely always done in consultation with international organizations such as the Codex. We have seen that for a large number of EU regulation, certain parts of the Codex Alimentarius Commission standards are blended into the regulations. Blended, I mean the text is added as such in the regulation, but there is no specific and formal reference to Codex standard for the reasons that I have explained earlier. And we have only a very few Codex product standards which are similar to Codex ones. And sorry, I presented this yesterday because typically the regulatory work of the EU is focused on food safety and not on food quality. We have a few standards that are regulatory for mineral waters, honey and fruit juices, and maybe a few others, which I don't have the full list of these, but in yesterday's slides, I have presented this, and there are no focus on the EU regulators on product quality, because it's meant that it's left to the market, and trading parties are able to develop or use whatever standards they like. It may be Codex standard, it may be UNECE, which is a body of harmonizing quality standards in Europe, or any other standards that they see fit. So this is the way the international and specifically Codex standards are used in the EU regulation. Thank you for your attention. Now we will see what is the situation on the Indonesian use of standards, of Codex standards. Over to you, Professor Dedi.
Okay, thank you very much, Ellen. So I think I will continue with my presentation. I will share screen now. I will explain about the use of Codex standard in Indonesian regulatory system very briefly, because I will already explain also in the last presentation, the last webinars. So I will start with this slide. Oke. Jadi yang sebetulnya kita di Indonesia itu mengandalkan kepada government regulation yang dikembangkan sebetulnya dari banyak laws, termasuk juga diambil dari Codex, ya. Jadi intinya adalah bahwa ada suatu hal yang spesifik ini, government regulation yang relatif baru, di mana dimasukkan di situ suatu artikel yang menyatakan bahwa dalam rangka untuk memperkuat pengawasan, ini maksudnya supervisi itu pengawasan, itu kepala badan dalam hal ini Indonesian FDA, Badan POM, itu mengkoordinasikan aktivitas dari risk analysis. Jadi tadi sampaikan bahwa analisis risiko itu terdiri daripada komponen assessment, management, dan communication. Nah, itu di state atau dinyatakan di dalam government regulation. Jadi sekarang Indonesia relatif mengembangkan pengawasannya berbasis risiko, gitu ya. Jadi itu yang baru mungkin ya dibandingkan dengan peraturan sebelumnya. Nah, ini yang sebetulnya dilakukan oleh Indonesia. Jadi prinsipnya adalah bahwa waktu mengembangkan standar sudah tentu berbasis dari Codex. Tapi ada juga mungkin pada saat standar tersebut akan direview, dibahas kembali, diperbaiki, maka dia akan melakukan sendiri. Jadi mungkin saya akan menjelaskan lebih detail sedikit bagaimana cara melakukannya. Jadi ini adalah konsepnya. Jadi dari artikel tersebut, dari pasal tersebut dinyatakan bahwa analisis risiko keamanan pangan dijadikan dasar untuk pengawasan, gitu ya. Nah, itu sebelah kiri yang hijau ini adalah sebetulnya terkait dengan manajemen risiko, di mana jika ada masalah-masalah baru ditemukan, maka kemudian akan ditelusuri, akan ditindaklanjuti dengan kegiatan lainnya, termasuk misalkan saja menyusun risiko, profil risiko. Nah, itu dituangkan dalam peraturan pemerintah tersebut. Jadi ada suatu artikel 58, bahwa dalam rangka melakukan surveillance, maka terlebih dahulu harus disusun dulu profil risiko. Nah, bagaimana menyusun profil risiko, dan kebetulan ini sudah diberikan trainingnya beberapa minggu yang lalu, juga di bawah kerjasama dengan EU RAIS, bahwa pertama kali harus dilakukan identifikasi masalah keamanan pangan. Waktu itu diberikan training bagaimana cara mengkaji pasangan bahaya pangan, karena itu akan kemudian dikaji seperti apa bahayanya kalau ada suatu bahaya, hazard dalam pangan, kemudian dikonsumsi, dan itu kemudian dilakukan kajian-kajian. Nah, sudah tentu sudah ada mekanismenya. Tadi seperti saya sampaikan di awal, bahwa kemudian dilakukanlah pengkajian risiko jika diperlukan bahwa ada suatu bahaya yang kemudian terdapat dalam pangan dan mungkin memberikan dampak kepada risiko kesehatan daripada konsumen. Dalam hal ini adalah orang Indonesia. Nah, bagi bahaya yang mungkin baru, ya, emerging, maka dilakukanlah kemudian kajian-kajian yang lengkap, yang detail, ya, termasuk menguji paparannya. Dan sudah tentu apa yang saya sampaikan di sini adalah karakteristik bahaya yang kemudian dikaji di situ. Ya, tadi saya mengatakan untuk kimia ada EDI, ada TDI, ya. Kemudian untuk microbial hazard kita melakukannya dengan kuantitatif risk assessment, ya, di sini yang juga sangat detail, gitu ya. Dengan demikian maka nanti akan dihasilkan, tadi saya sampaikan juga ada safety margin dan seterusnya. Nah, umumnya di Indonesia kaidah-kaidah dari kodeks itu digunakan lebih banyak mungkin bukan untuk melakukan assessment yang emerging, tapi mungkin mengkaji apa yang sudah ada. Ya, jadi misalkan saja kalau misalkan Indonesia sekarang punya suatu standar, katakanlah untuk aditif maupun untuk kontaminan, kemudian dia dianggap perlu itu dikaji kembali apakah peraturan tersebut atau standar tersebut masih melindungi penduduknya, ya, maka dilakukanlah review. Nah, untuk review ini tidak lagi untuk melakukan atau mengkaji menetapkan EDI atau TDI, bukan, tapi hanya untuk mereview apakah paparan daripada bahaya tersebut masih ada di bawah EDI atau konsumsi per harinya, per kilogram berat badan, apakah masih aman. Maksudnya masih aman adalah masih di bawah EDI yang ada atau yang sudah di atas. Kalau ini ada di sebelah kiri, tadi saya mengatakan bahwa itu masih aman. Artinya regulasi standar masih bisa melindungi penduduknya. Tapi kalau sudah di sebelah kanan, berarti sudah melebihi EDI, maka itu kemudian perlu dikaji seberapa besar kita merevisi dari peraturan tersebut sehingga kita bisa melakukan perlindungan terhadap konsumen. Jadi kira-kira seperti ini. Jadi dihitung kembali nanti maksimum level yang sudah ada, misalkan saja MRL sudah ada, kemudian dihitung sehingga kita mempunyai maksimum level yang baru, baik untuk aditif ataupun kontaminan. Ya. Jadi standar keamanannya bisa disesuaikan. Mungkin diperketat atau dilonggarkan. Kalau dilonggarkan mungkin tidak ya. Tapi kalau dilonggarkan tidak boleh lebih longgar dari kodeks ya. Mungkin diperketat kalau memang standar tersebut sudah tidak bisa melindungi. Artinya konsumen sudah lebih banyak mengkonsumsi pasangan bahaya pangan tersebut. Nah itu yang dilakukan di Indonesia, mereview kembali standar. Sudah tentu berbasis risk analysis dari Codex. Itu yang diaplikasikan. Oke, yang kedua, nah ini kebetulan sudah saya sampaikan di dalam presentasi 16 November, bahwa kita mengikuti Codex dalam rangka sebetulnya dua standar ini. Ini pun ada di dalam PP 86 tahun 2019 terkait dengan food sanitation, gitu ya. Jadi di situ memang kemudian dijadikan dasar untuk menjadi standar food production. Bagaimana standarnya? Itu kan untuk preventif. Jadi standarnya adalah berbasis food sanitation, berbasis good practices, berbasis HACCP. Itu yang kemudian dikembangkan sebagai standar produksi. Itu yang diterapkan kalau suatu kementerian lembaga menerapkan sertifikasi daripada sarana yang memproduksi, ya. Jadi bisa saja misalkan sarana pertanian kemudian memberikan sertifikasi berdasarkan standar produksi tersebut, termasuk juga perikanan, termasuk juga olahan di Badan POM. Dan kemudian satu lagi adalah mengembangkan standar produk. Produk ini ada dua jenis, horizontal, saya sudah menyampaikan juga pada kesempatan sebelumnya, dan vertikal standar. Jadi mohon maaf saya mengulang-ulang, tapi ini adalah intinya daripada penerapan standar dari Codex. Kita melakukan itu, dan kemudian ini diacu juga dari Codex Committee dari Codex Committee on Food Hygiene, Food Additive, dan seterusnya. Dan kemudian juga itulah yang kemudian dijadikan dasar bagi kita di Indonesia untuk mengembangkan standar maupun mereview standar yang sudah ada agar supaya standar tersebut atau regulasi tersebut masih bisa melindungi konsumen. Nah, tadi saya menyatakan standar of production, standar produksi. Nah, itu yang saya sampaikan sebelumnya. Jadi yang dijadikan dasar adalah dalam PP 86 itu adalah artikel-artikel, pasal-pasal yang terkait dengan food sanitasi, gitu ya. Di mana di situ adalah menghindari penggunaan bahan yang bisa mengancam, ya, pangan di sepanjang food chain, ya. Kemudian memenuhi persyaratan cemaran dan sebagainya. Mengendalikan proses, saya berikan contoh waktu itu bagaimana mengendalikan proses retorting agar supaya bisa menjamin nilai F0 agar supaya bisa aman konsumsi. Kemudian ada traceability macam-macam. Nah, itu kemudian dituangkan dalam good practices. Itulah yang saya katakan sebagai standard of production. Kemudian standar produk, saya juga berikan contoh. Ini adalah horizontal standard. Saya berikan contoh waktu itu aditif, ya, dan juga kontaminan. Dan kemudian juga saya berikan contoh vertikal standar, yaitu dikembangkan oleh BSN untuk mengembangkan standar nasional Indonesia. Di sini contohnya Ken Sardin dan Mackerel waktu itu. Dan ini sudah tentu juga berbasis standar dari Codex, berbasis acuan guideline dari Codex bagaimana menyusun SND. Dan saya kira itu semua diterapkan di Indonesia dan sudah tentu selalu direview. Saya kira akan bagus sekali karena memang kita mengacu Codex secara konsisten. Itu mungkin penerapan yang ada terkait dengan Codex di Indonesia. Jadi terima kasih atas perhatiannya. Mari kita lanjutkan sekarang dengan program. Saya stop screen ya. Baik, demikian. Silakan Mbak Widi, siapa ya?
Baik, Prof. Dedi, ini untuk kalian berarti sudah juga ya?
Saya nggak tahu, apakah dia masih punya lagi nggak?
Masih,
Tapi mungkin.
ya. Apakah masih ada dari lain?
Yes, yes, it's coming.
We still have a material to discuss?
Yes, yeah, sure.
For private standards?
Let me share. Let me share the screen. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, good. Very good.
Something. Okay. Okay, so we will now move to the presentation on private standards. And of course, it's very huge topic, and we cannot expect to go into the detail for each private standard. But what I will try to do is to provide you a framework to understand what they are and where they come from and what are the issues. But first, before speaking on private standard, let us review or speak a little bit on public standards. We have all the national or international food safety standards based on Codex or ISO, HACCP and ISO 20000 family. We know very well that all the standards are for voluntary use and certification. At the same time, they can be used in technical regulation for official controls. And when sorry, yeah, okay. And when these international or national standards are used into technical regulation, food business operators have a legal obligation for compliance. So the countries and the competent authorities can use and can pass this technical regulation as part of the food risk management in response to a perceived market failure or for addressing negative consequence of a food process when it creates unsafe food, when there is too much waste or when there is fraud, and also for creating public goods. Public health is a public good, and positive environment impact is also a public good. So that is the purpose of using international food safety standards in technical regulations. So the objective of a public standard, either used voluntarily or in a mandatory way, is to achieve within the society an optimal level of food safety or environmental health protection. The purpose is to increase food safety of average outputs. And of course, it's a mid-term approach. There is no immediate result. The approach is mid-term or long-term. However, the regulators, the persons in charge of regulating food safety and in many countries are facing challenges. Different countries are using similar standards, but they implement the standards differently. They have policy consideration, social issue, economic priorities, different level of resources, etc. Regulating and the use of public standards have implications for export because regulating food safety can lead to different competitiveness level for the exporters. And they have also impact on import. Some countries are developing environmental tariffs or restrictions based on the level of food safety or sustainability. And this has led to trade frictions. We have ongoing with GMOs, genetically modified organisms, beef hormones. In the past, it has been recently closed between the EU and the USA. It has been just closed last month at the WTO. It has lasted for almost 6 or 7 years anyway. We have also disputes based on the country of origin legislations, etc. All this creates challenges to the WTO. So, nevertheless, in the meantime, we have seen the development of private standards. And what are they, these private standards? These are standards designed and owned by non-governmental entities. And these entities, these bodies can be either businesses or not-for-profit sectors entities. What are the key objectives of private standards? The objectives are to achieve within the supply chain an increased level of conformity for a specific set of requirements. These requirements can be environmental, social, food safety, and quality. It's not only about food safety. The purpose of private standards is to minimize the risk, not to manage, but to minimize. And this effect is sought after at any time and for every shipment. So we can see a very salient, a very important difference between public standards, even when they are used in regulation, and private standards. Public standards apply at the level of a country. They deal with all the food business operators of all of the supply chains. And their purpose is rather an average effect, positive effect on a midterm, whereas private standards are developed within a supply chain. It's a small part of the food business operators. And they focus on additional increased level of conformity. So that's why also these private standards are not applied in the same way as public standards. Very few public standards are used based on a certification. Yes, in same, but private standards are always based on certification, and their implementation is based on scheme, food safety scheme or standard scheme, which allow to assess the supplier's conformity to the requirement of the standards owner. I will come into the detail on this later on. The scheme recognition may include a label placed on the products, and that is what we call in the jargon B2C, business to consumers, when standards are used up to the end user. So there is a label on the product on the marketplace. Or sometimes there is no label and the standard is used only between trading parties and is not visible for the consumer. And so when information is exchanged and certification is used between supplier and buyer, it's called B2B, business to business. So these are a few of these private standards. There is a wide variety, and of course I did not intend to present all the standards, but these are some of the most famous brands and names. So we have the IFS, International Feature Standards, which deal with food safety, mostly in the distribution, but also processing and retail stages. We have the Assured Food Standards, which was developed for the primary production in the UK. We have the Fair Trade Standards here, which is the logo of the food labeling organization. We have product-specific standards, Salmon Safe. We have the Food Alliance. We have the gluten-free certification. We have Nature Choice, which is a specific retailer, which is Tesco brand. and we have GFSI, we have Global Gap, many other British BRC. BRC stands for British Retailers Consortium, which is the Association of Retail Chains of the UK. So as you see, there are many standards. They are all linked to a specific market segment or to a specific marketing channel. So allow me to give a little bit a classification among these private standards. We have three kinds of private standards: voluntary consensus standards, proprietary standards owned by individual firms, and third-party standards. The first one, the voluntary consensus standards, are developed by a coalition of firms, and at times they may involve governments. One of the very famous of such voluntary consensus standards is Global Gap. We have also the Assure Food Standards developed in the UK in cooperation with the government. We have the British Retailer Consortium. We have the SAI, which means for Sustainable Agriculture International. We have the IFS International Feature Standards for food safety in the distribution and processing sectors. We have the Safe and Quality Food Standard, which was initially developed by the government of Western Australia, and then which has been taken over by the private sector to implement food safety schemes in Australia. We have also several organic standards which fall under this category. In terms of proprietary standards, we can state the Tesco Natural Choice, the Whole Food Markets. We have also, we have also indicated geographic as I use the French word. There's a geographic indication, protected geographic indication standards. These are standards developed by a specific firm or a specific group of operators for their own purpose. Starbucks, for example, it's also an example of such standards. And the last category is the third-party standards. There are standards developed by independent organizations. It may be NGO or independent standard setting bodies. For example, IFOAM, International Federation of Organic Agricultural Movements. This is an association, a federation of associations that develops standards, organic standards for all their members. They develop standards and they develop also rules for certification, how the standards should be implemented, and conformity to the standards should be demonstrated. We have the 4C coffee, that's 4C code, that's for coffee production and trading. We have the fair trade standards developed by the Food Fair Labeling Organization. And we have also the national GAPs. The National Good Agricultural Practice are standards developed by usually it's public sector in different countries. It can be the government. It can be also a grouping between government agency and agricultural association. They develop the National Good Agricultural Practice codes, which may be based on Codex codes or regional codes or that allow to adapt international or regional standards to the country situation. So coming back to the food safety area. This is what we know about food safety standards. We have at the lower level, the first small circle is a prerequisite program, good hygiene practice and good manufacturing practices. Then we have these standards are a prerequisite, are the basis, the foundation layer that allow to develop HACCP standards and implement this HACCP standard in the food business. Again, when you have this in place, another standard can be adopted and used. This is the ISO 22000 on family. I say family because there are different modules in the ISO 22000, and they are used in different situations. But let us keep the ISO 22000 wording for the sake of ease of presentation. And then we have the level 4, the blue circle, which represents the private standards, FSSC 22000 and Global Gap. So what is the difference between all this? So this is how it stands in terms of possibility of use and what the standards are useful for. We can see that the first level, PRP and GMP, is used for regional trade in low-risk products. It can be used by some local traders within the countries and for cross-border trade. And that's very specific. We can see many examples of this in the ASEAN region. And they are also used for official controls. They are regulated, but usually official controls authorities, competent authorities, do not require certification or do not require third-party certification, but they encourage the food business operator to use this code of practices, and in particular for low-risk products. At the second level, HACCP, we see that these standards can be used in official controls for higher risk level, but they are used also for international trade. For example, HACCP, the use of HACCP is necessary as an import requirement for the EU bloc and for the USA. And they can be also used in addition to official regulation for high-end local clients. In many countries, if you want to trade food for catering, for hospitals, for schools, for specific destination, then the supplier, the client or the buyer of food requires the supplier to have an HACCP certification. So the third level is used for specific we have a kind of echo. I don't know where it's come from. Okay, thank you. The third level, the level of ISO 22000, is used for high-end local or regional clients for high-risk products. It's used for export to wholesalers, for example, in the EU or Japan, also for high-risk products. And it's used in the global supply chain, like, for example, commodity traders like Olam and Cargill. As soon as they are purchasing processed food, they will ask the facility to be certified to ISO 22000. So it could seem that the ISO 22000 is the most demanding standard in terms of food safety, but even so, there are a certain kind of importers and food traders that have additional requirements. And that's what I write with food safety +++. there's export to retail groups in the EU or USA. And we can state, for example, Walmart, we can state Deleuze, we can state Migros in Switzerland, and many others. All these large retail groups are requesting more than the basic level of HACCP or ISO 22000, and they have developed their own standards, which consist of the basic or the advanced requirement at level E, I, or 1, 2, 3 here, plus additional criteria and requirement. Let me explain a little bit what are the additional requirements. Sorry, I cannot change the slide. That's a bit of, yes, it's coming. Okay, these are the difference between the level. At the level 1, the small orange circle, to demonstrate compliance, we need standard operating procedures and records. This is the basis to verification or certification. It's the same for HACCP. To verify your HACCP system, you need to have the CCP validation list, which must be documented, write it down, and we need to have SOP and standard operating procedures and record as documents. That's what you have to show to the competent authority inspectors when they come to your food business. If you want to have a certification to HACCP by a third party or by your supplier, you need to add an HACCP plan, which is a specific document that has to be kept updated. You need to have probably a HACCP manual, and you need to show staff qualification records, in addition to the other SOP and records. Now, at the level of ISO 22000, this is much more demanding. You need to have all what is in place for the HACCP level, but you need to show also that you have a food safety management system in place. And this food safety management system includes a policy, a food safety policy, which reflects the commitment of the top management of the organization. You need to have some risk assessment or risk evaluation of risk in your business that has to be carried out and documented. And you need to demonstrate arrangement for the control of inputs and the control of waste. Of course, you need to have the HACCP plan fully documented. You need to have process standard operating procedures. You need to have arrangement for internal audit and document controls, etc., etc. So all this is described in the ISO 22000, and those requirements must be fully complied, and records have to be kept on how to comply. And I forgot to mention, of course, there are requirements on the capability of staff in terms of competence to understand, prepare, design, and implement the different components of the system. So this is those of you who have been implementing a food safety management system at the ISO 22000 level. You know that it's very demanding and it's lots of hard work, and really lots of detail have to be taken care of. So what are the additional criteria and what are the additional demands introduced by the private standards? Basically, there's of course, here I explained for the two main standards, FSSC 22000, which applies to food processors, and Global Gap will apply more for primary production, but also for some processors of feed, for example. each standard will have first additional consideration. But relating specifically to food safety, they request more additional category of criteria on traceability. Traceability is much more developed, and they introduce more detail at the level of the daily traceability, the load, and much more than as yesterday we have seen one level up, one level down. It's much more detailed in private standards. They have also a different disposition in terms of auditing. Certification to ISO 22000 is one initial audit, and then audit every 2 years, and that's it. Not so with FSSC 22000 and Global Gap. The frequency of audit is depend on, of course, the scope and the nature of business, but it's more, the frequency is higher than for the commercial certification to 22000. They have also introduced the unannounced audits. At any time, you can have an unannounced audit, which you cannot escape, you cannot decline. There are also more demanding interpretation of the GAP. If you look at the GAP as such, they are all the same, not all the same, I should not say, but you take ASEAN GAP, basically it's, I would say, all the GAP in the world, you have 80% of common requirement. But let us take one of the most comprehensive code of good agricultural practice. Let us take the Codex 1, for example, and each criteria is described. Okay, then how is it implemented? They have, and Codex has developed also checklist. Checklist is the way the criteria should be addressed. And then private standard owners go much more in detail, because there is a way to interpret the criteria, and there is a way on how to check that the criteria is implemented. And this is where the difficulty and the severity of audit and verification stands. And when Global Gap auditors come, the way they interpret the requirement and then the way they check is much more demanding than in other commercial GAP certifiers. At time, for example, the Global Gap introduced more stringent criteria for microbiological contents or contaminant contents. So this is what this is where the difference are between the international standards and the platform of HACCP and ISO 22000 and the private standards. The private standards, food safety standards, consist of this international foundation, and they introduce additional, more demanding requirement, either in terms of scope. There may be requirement on labor condition, on hygiene, on traceability, on information, on sustainability, the use of IPM, the requirement for biodiversity. And they have also increased level of scrutiny in the way the auditors of this private food safety scheme, private food safety standard, in the way the auditors verify and interpret the conformity to requirements. So now I will come to a detailed presentation of some standard Global Gap, namely later on, but we would like to understand why these private standards have been developed and why finally they are just, now everybody is speaking about private standards, but why is the result? Because there are multiple dimensions in food quality, and consumers have become aware and sensitive to a range of issues, like we have food miles, carbon footprint, organic products, animal welfare, natural products, health impact of food, origin, source, local, GMOs, genetically modified organisms, labor standards, fair trade. All this came from new consumer attitudes. At the individual level, consumers, especially in developed countries or advanced market, but also in the developing economies and emerging economies or intermediate levels, countries, individual consumers have more interest in where the food comes from and how it has been produced. And even in the ASEAN, you have markets like Indonesian market, especially, you have a part of the population, of the urban population, is much more curious and demanding on the quality and safety of food. But that's also the case in Malaysia. That's also the case in Singapore, in Thailand. And there is a growing interest for safe and natural food or organic food. And all these issues are taken into account. And at the community level, this is reflected in increased community awareness on food system. What are the food system? How the food supply is organized? How the official controls work? And how all this has an impact on the health. So this is true in every area of the world, not only in Asia and ASEAN. It's true in even in the remotest part of the Pacific or everywhere in the world. And there is a connection which is done between the food safety, the food waste, and the sustainability of the way we produce and use food. As we know, this was also central to the COP26, but this is also reflected at the individual consumer level. So these private standards can be understood as a way to respond to the challenge in food markets. On the purely food safety area, the private standard allow to give a clear assignment of legal responsibility to food chain operators for ensuring food safety. And then, yet they also, we know that the food supply chains become more and more globalized and complex. So the large operators in these global supply chains, the retail chains or the large commodity traders, they have difficulties. It's very difficult to manage a supply chain that spread over several countries and on several levels. So the private standards are useful. They are tools that enable easier or better management of the supply chain, of the flow of products and the access and the delivery of products across the chain. Incidentally, there's using private standards uniformly across this global supply chain, as opposed to using separate national standards and national regulation, lowers the transaction cost because it facilitates sourcing. It makes the sourcing more homogeneous across country. It facilitates negotiation. The supply chain operators don't have to learn the different ways of national regulation or national standards. And it facilitates monitoring of conformity because it's the same criteria and the same way of assessment in different countries. So in short, we understand that private standards are a tool for value chain leaders, for the most important operators in value chain, to manage the risk and reduce their liability. This applies to food safety risk. This applies to regulatory litigation risk. Regulatory means the compliance of these food chain operators on the final market where they operate. It can be Japan, it can be Brazil, it can be EU, it can be everywhere. By adopting very high standards, they can be assured that they will comply with the national level. And of course, these private standards are useful to prevent risk in terms of reputation or image. And this is not very well understood because most of these private standards don't have a label, apart the proprietary ones, or apart a very few standards have a label. So the consumer don't know that these private standards have been used in the supply chain. But for the value chain, the value chain leaders, the large operators of the global value chain, if there is an incident, if there is a food poisoning, if there is an hygiene, this becomes a huge problem. And this global value chain are active on several countries and on markets that gather thousands or millions of consumers. And of course, information goes very fast on the social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. So these global operators, they are exposed to a risk in case of food safety incident or accident or poisoning. This can damage the reputation and lead to poor economic and financial performance. So these private sectors also are a way to, private sector standards are a way to mitigate or to prevent this risk. So we know that many, sorry, I see that we have questions in the chat. No, okay. These private standards, we know, and most of you are certainly aware that there has been lots of discussion over the last 10 years on private standards. It has been discussed in the SPS committee of the WTO. It has been discussed at the Codex conference. It has been discussed in international forums on food safety and regional forums on food safety. And there is very little that can be really done or change. First, because private standards, well, they are private. They are not under the mandate of the WTO. They are not under the mandate of Codex. So after all these discussions and consideration, what is the result? The result is the consideration that there are several issues and challenges. Private sector standards are useful for certain kind of operators, and we have to understand what are the issue and challenge and see if this issue and challenge can be accommodated, and whether ultimately private standards have an interest for specific categories of operators at the level of the country. So this list is not, of course, exhaustive, but this is the first one is the benchmarking and harmonization. Private standards are increasingly benchmarked, and I will explain this later on in the presentation. And this allows access to multiple clients. One company which is benchmark, which is using Global Gap, can also access other, can sell on all the operators which are using and recognizing Global Gap, but probably will be also able to sell to other clients using, for example, BRC or using other standards. Operators are able to transmit more easily information along the chain. So that's more an internal value chain benefit in terms of managing food safety requirement and in terms of traceability. Private standards and the private standard certification scheme allow to manage better the flow of products along the chain. Then private standards encourage products and markets differentiation, because private standards usually allow to produce and to manufacture products with a high level of food safety and quality, allow to generate premium products. So it differentiates the products from other products in a country which are less controlled or which have lower level of food safety and quality, or different characteristics. So it creates a differentiation. It allows producers to get higher prices for their product or to sort the product in a better way. At the same time, there are, as I have shown in the previous slide, there are many different labels, different marks, different logo pictures, different claims, and this creates confusion for the consumer. Well, consumers are not always very well aware on the needs for certification, and we know that in the supermarkets or even in the fresh markets, there are many claims, or on the internet virtual marketplace, there are many claims that are not based upon official or certified documents. So it's difficult for the consumer when there are several dozens of labels and claims and brands to understand what has been certified, what is based on a framework of standards, private or public or third-party standards, and what is purely a marketing claim or a vague promotional claim. And that's an issue which is still constraining a little bit the development of premium foods and which is constraining the development of more transparent markets. And then, of course, it has been recognized and discussed that the development of the private standards, in particular Global Gap, makes a challenge for exporters from developing countries which have less capacities to conform and to access to this global value chain. We'll detail this later in the next slides. And it is also well recognized that the compliance costs can be significant. It's more costly to develop the compliance for private standards. Also, this is seen as an investment. The recurring costs are similar, but the upfront cost to develop the systems and to get the first certification is quite important. It has been also noted by some researchers that the private standard development is done with low, not in an open way. So there is less openness than in the international work on standards, and stakeholders tend to be less involved in the development of private standards. That's an issue that was noted several years ago, and most of the private standard owners have done some progress in terms of involving stakeholders and consulting the public on this. And another inconvenience related to private standards, it's that it requires asset-specific investment by the suppliers, asset-specific investment means that to comply with certain private standards, you need to invest in specific solution to comply with the standards in your farm or in your processing company. And this is more than the simple compliance which is required by the competent authority. And of course, this investment and this compliance to one private standard or to one scheme. So once you have done this for one scheme, you are locked. You are kind of locked, and you have you are linked to this private standard and to this value chain. So it's not easy to shift and to develop the conformity for other standards. So this is the market power of these private standards owners. They try to catch the supplier and to maintain them in their system. So these are a few side effects and issues that have been identified by researchers and that are worth to be taken into consideration when you have certain categories of producers or certain subsectors that comes and want to access private standards. I mean, in terms of being a trade promotion authority or being agriculture development authority in one country, this issue has to be taken into consideration and discussed before developing support program. I try to change let me change the slide. Yes. So basically, otherwise, in order to demonstrate conformity to private standard, it's the same as conformity assessment certification by for voluntary standards and open standards in any place of the world. It's based on audits. So the first step will be the first layer is to keep internal audits and have the internal control system in place. And then the second stage is request or compliance with the supplier audit. It is done usually by an independent party. In the private standard scheme, there are arrangements, there are text documents stating how the third-party suppliers, the certifiers should come and carry out the audit. And there is also a specific arrangement, contractual arrangement between the certifiers and the scheme owners. And usually, most of the scheme requires certifiers to be accredited. So, and this is certification as it is done usually by for other standards. And the third-party certifiers will do the first evaluation audit. It's also in two steps. There is adequacy audit and documentation review, and after on-site visit and certification audit, which leads to the certification of the FBO to the specific private standards. So now I would like to give an introduction on two of the main private standards, Global Gap, which started in 1997 as Europe Gap, and it was created by the large EU retail groups. So it has been created in 1997, and 30 years later, in 2017, there is 200,000 producers certified to any of the Global Gap standards. So just a comment here in passing. This is not very much. This is not very much. For example, we know that, roughly speaking, in Indonesia alone, there are about 55 million of people depending. In all the world, it's estimated that there is above 550 million families or people depending on farming. So we are speaking about a very, very small proportion of producers using global gap standards for the farming purpose. But anyway, global gap is actually a brand of solution of services which are provided, developed and provided to develop smart farm insurance. It has been developed by a private company which is called Food Plus GmbH. It's a limited company in Germany. So it develops solution services in the form of standards and conformity assessment procedures. And it sells this service to value chain operators who wants to use it, or producers who want to access to the global value chain. And this development and work is done in cooperation between producers, retailers, and other stakeholders. Now, the Global Gap certification covers not only food safety and traceability, but also environment, including biodiversity. It relates to integrated crop management, integrated pest controls. It deals also with workers' health, food safety and welfare, workers' safety and welfare, animal welfare, quality management system, and HACCP. Basically, it's not only food safety, it's much more broad, but the Global Gap system is not monolithic. It's not one single standard. There are several standards and modules, and I will present this as follows. This is the Global Gap ecosystem. We see we have different models. So the primary, the first module or the first core standard is this one, the primary farm assurance module. It's a core level which includes mostly food safety, gap, and traceability. This is the primary level, and it's developed further into what is called an integrated farm assurance, which is really the core and the most important block in the Global Gap ecosystem. It includes three main modules. It has an all-farm base, which are the common requirements that all the farming operators must conform with. And after, it has modules which are based on, modules which are based on the nature of the scope. So it can be the crops, it can be the livestock, it can be aquaculture. And in addition to this scheme, this separate integrated farm assurance IFA scheme has also modules that relate to the subscope. It means within livestock, you have dairy, you have chicken, you have poultry, you have cattle, you have many others. And the same for aquaculture, you have different subscopes. Then this is really the most important and the most used of the Global Gap standards. But Global Gap has developed also separate and side modules. So we have here, for example, the produce safety assurance. Produce safety assurance, produce safety assurance is a module that relates only for horticultural produce and only for food safety and traceability, specifically. Then we have product handling assurance. It's specific for people, for the operators who do not process food or who do not change the nature of food, but who just transport food or produce from one point to the other. We have then other specific module, harmonized product safety. this is a module which is developed specifically for the USA market and USA operators, because it's aligned with the regulations, the US regulation, the Food Safety Modernization Act. So it allows the US-based operators, also they are using a private standard, to be immediately compliant with the US regulation. There is also a module on feed manufacture, which has a specific requirement and traceability and contaminants requirement contents. There is also, I don't know, there is also this plant propagation material, which is maybe used in combination with the primary farm assurance or the integrated farm assurance, or it can be used as standalone certification scheme for the operators that produce vegetable material for planting, like vegetable horticultural plants, etc. And there is also a local gap module, which I will detail on the next slides. So these are all modules of service. Each of these modules has specific standards which are documented and updated, upgraded regularly, and they have modalities for certification, auditing, and of course, global gap service are very, very comprehensive. They also include they also, within the global gap, they provide and auditors training and recognition services. And there is also a global gap academy to discuss and to be trained and to discuss the ongoing food safety and sustainability aspects. So, yes, we see that global gap, finally, it's a range, a family of standards for safe, socially and environmentally responsible farming practices, as well as other side handling and processing, feed processing practices. Now, the integrated farm assurance module is now being extended to a label. The producers which are using this and which are certified will be able to use the Global Gap Network label, which is new. It has been introduced a couple of years ago and is still under development. The other module, which is on produce safety assurance, as I explained, it concerns only the certification of food safety element throughout the entire production cycle, including origin input to the packaging. But at the moment, there is no label for this produce safety assurance. So this is the difference between the core standard of Global Gap, the integrated farm assurance for food and vegetable standards, and the produce food safety assurance standards. This one has 141 control points requirements, and 105 on food safety and 36 on traceability. Whereas the integrated farm assurance for fruit and vegetable has 221 control points. And you can see that the thematic area include environment, workers' health and safety, traceability, and food safety. Basically, just as a matter of comparison, the ASEAN GAP standard, which is equivalent, would be comparable to this standard, has 174 control points and has, it has the same preoccupations, the same concerns on environment, but there is nothing on biodiversity. There's very little requirement on workers' health and safety, and also less requirement on food safety. So this is a Global Gap family of products. And we have the global gap integrated farm assurance, product food safety assurance, product handling, crops for processing, harmonized product safety. All these modules, which I have presented in the slide with colored hexagons, these are the core family or the core group. Now, there is Global Gap has introduced recently, five or 6 years ago, they introduced what they call local gap. The primary farm assurance is a module which includes a subset reduced requirement, and they do so to allow, it's an entry level, it's a stepping stone to allow farmers which have less capacity, smaller farmers, smallholders, to enter into the Global Gap family of standards. And finally, after a short time, to access the global value chain. And on the other side, on the right side of the slide, Global Gap has also developed add-on. Add-on is additional module, additional, and it's already very demanding, the core standards, but they still have developed add-on module. I explain a few of these modules, add-on module here below. You have what they call the GRASP is on occupational health and safety. It's tier 4. It's a module which deals with fusarium contamination, biosecurity for banana. There is a FSMA, PSR, it's a public safety requirement. It's a module, an add-on that makes full compliance with USA regulation. There is a module on sustainable meat. There is a module on, this one is developed for Tesco. Nurture module is to, I think it relates to environmental conservation. There is a spring module, which is concerned about water use and conservation. There is a module on responsible operation. There is a module on animal welfare, on GMOs. There is a module on specific for South Africa. The South Africa community has developed environmental standards, and Global Gap has created a model to reflect this in their practice. There is also other module for sustainability, assessment international, and for retailers, European retailers. These are European, this one is Deleuze, and this is specific because they have additional requirements. So the Global Gap is actually trying to adapt to specific niche markets and specific very high level and premium markets by developing small add-on and small module that can be plugged in the other module, which makes actually things easier for certain producers because they are not obliged to comply with a full range of specification, but at the same time, it's more work, and it can be justified because their specific market have high value. So now this is the end for Global Gap. Of course, everything which I have presented is explained in some detail on their website. There is a Global Gap community. We can become member and receive information regularly. All the documents, all the Global Gap standards, and the checklist can be downloaded for free on their website. So information is shared and it's fully transparent for the government agency or for the private operators who want to develop or promote or support the farmers in adopting and developing the standards. Now, I would like to say I have a full slide on the Global Food Safety Initiative. Global Food Safety is part of the Consumer Good Forum. Consumer Good Forum is all the big names that sell consumer goods. So you see on the slides, you certainly know most of these names. but so this is an association of big retailers. Only 37 members, but you can be sure that the 37 members are placing on the consumer markets more than 95% of the products, of the volume of products. So, of course, they are important in that sense. The Global Food Safety Initiative try to benchmark and harmonize all the private standards which are used by the business. So this is important and this is useful because they try to foster mutual acceptance of the standards which has been benchmarked, and they try to push for a common certification programs across the industry. The idea is that once certified, a producer should be recognized everywhere. And this is in the interest of producers and farmers worldwide because it reduces the duplication and the need to duplicate audit, and globally it reduces trade barriers. So basically, they work on benchmarking the certification scheme owners and also personal recognition bodies. For example, you have Global Gap, you have Tesco Nature Choice, you have BRC, you have the IFC. The idea is to internationally recognize or demonstrate that these schemes are equivalent. The outcome of the implementation of the standards is equivalent. And if one auditor is capable of auditing BRC, then he should be also recognized to audit Global Gap or Tesco or Walmart or whatever. And we see this is in the interest of suppliers and producers in the developing countries. Because when you want to certify one group of farmers to Global Gap, for example, basically you can use a local auditor if there are local auditors. I know there are in Indonesia, but in some other countries, for example, in Cambodia, you won't have, in Myanmar, you won't have. So you will have to find and you have to fly in an auditor. And if this person is capable of auditing different private standards, then you can organize the certification of several other, like for organic or for BRC or if one person is capable of auditing multiple, then you can organize and then you can share the cost of transportation and the cost of audits for across multiple operators. So the GFSI is quite a good initiative. They also have a progressive approach and modular approach because, of course, GFSI tried to benchmark the highest level scheme. Basically, GFSI is more working for processors. They are not interested in primary production at the moment. So they have developed a progressivity, like allowing people to enter at the, that's what they call their global market program. They try to open the certification at a basic level, and after the operators have 1 year to fill the gap and go to the intermediate level, and after they have another 1 year, 12 months to reach the basic GFSI level, which is international, basically that's the ISO 22000 level, and then to reach the international private standard level, FSSC 22000. So this is a way of introducing flexibility in the application of these private standards for SLDB, small or less developed business. And this is in response to a challenge or a claim made by several operators and several farmers and processors associations in the world, saying that it was too difficult to comply to the highest level private standards. And that's FAO has introduced in the Food and Nutrition paper of 1986, they introduced a guidance to the government on the application of HACCP in smaller and less developed food business. And this has been taken into account also at the level of private standard scheme owners. So GFSI is one of those initiatives. So they introduce this global market program of manufacturing. This basically provide training for developing for operators which are developing their food safety management system through a systematic and continuous improving process. Through this program, GFSI support and mentor the supplier, and they also encourage linkage and linkage with local sourcing and manufacturing, and they develop mutual acceptance along the local, regional, and international supply chain. So this is what I have shown here. Like operators with this global market, people can get recognized and assessed at the basic and intermediate level, and they can connect with local and regional suppliers, and gradually they can access the higher private standards level, and then they can access the international value chain. And the members, the certificate scheme owners, they provide support for those producers who enter at the basic and intermediate level. And the flexibility also is introduced by a global gap with their local gap module. It's a local standard which has been developed for agricultural supply chain in developing economies and for small and less developed operators. That's the entry level of the global gap family. And they provide, it's used as a capacity building tool for producers to access local and regional market. It's meant as a building block for producers who need to access the IFA or primary farm assurance certification. But this local gap level is not covered by certification. Global gap scheme does not ensure certification, but only verification and recognition. So let me show you a short video from Global Gap explaining the local gap concept.
The food industry, including retailers, supermarkets, and processors, is increasingly demanding certification from its producers. However, in the case of small or emerging producers, meeting this demand quickly can be challenging. That is why Global Gap designed Local Gap, the key purpose of capacity building. Local Gap is the entry level of the Global Gap family of products. It's not covered under certification, but follows an assessment approach. Local Gap offers primary farm assurance with a PFA standard, which consists of different levels. Each of these levels is a subset of requirements from the Global Gap standards. Producers can start at the lowest level and gradually progress to the next level. Eventually, producers can progress to Global Gap certification in a time frame acceptable to the customer or market. PFA also works as a local standard, but only for producers supplying their local markets and only if those markets accept it. As a first step, the producer has to register with a local GAP approved certification body or verification body. Each producer then receives their own unique local GAP number or LGN. Once the producer has been assessed and has met all the requirements, they receive a letter of conformance, which is valid for 1 year. With local GAP, producers can now adopt good agricultural practices through a stepwise approach that can improve the efficiency of farm management, minimize food safety risks, and comply with legislation on food safety. This will give producers increased access to local and regional markets, even while they are working their way up to global GAP certification. For more information, please contact us at localgap@globalgap.org or visit our website at localgap.org.
Okay, so this is the way Global Gap tries to introduce flexibility and a progression from the primary basic level and to the higher level. And actually, I have shown this slide because it's also reflects a much broader debate on how public and private sector can cooperate to develop food safety in the value chain and with spillover, with additional benefits, developing food safety in all the countries. As we know, as shown in the video, the developing countries have difficulties at times to develop food safety system and to reach a high level of food safety. And so, to some extent, private standards, and especially when they are supported by flexibility arrangements, private standards can be seen as complementary and supporting the official regulatory standards which are developed. Of course, we must be aware that these private standards benefit at the beginning, and they benefit to a very small proportion of the consumers, but because they allow integration to a global value chain, and because they have a potential to train and to develop the capacity of the producers, they can also benefit to sub-parts of the value chain and local value chain, local supermarkets and local operators. So this is also, again, part of a broader discussion on how private standards and private conformity as a certification scheme can be useful or can be utilized by official controls to contribute to the development of food safety and achieving food safety policy objectives in the countries. And this is one of the debates which is very current and very hot debate these days, because even at the international level, it's not well understood the interaction, the interplay between private operators, private certifier, private standards and official control, and the divide and the possible synergies between official control, regulatory work, and the private and private sector, which have a very heavy and very strong economic power. This is still in the making. There are lots of debate in international forums. Mostly these are consumer association forum or retailer forums like the GFSI or Consumer Good Forum, but many other forums on food safety also. There is much less debate on the international standardization agency like Codex or ISO or even the video. These are because this is still in the making, and there is no a single approach. There is a different initiative, lots of different initiative in Asia, in America, in the Pacific, in Europe, in Africa. There are different ways of doing things, and this is an area which is still under development and which requires our attention. And there are some very good examples on how food safety private schemes have been used, especially in Australia and New Zealand, but also in Peru. And I don't have all the example in mind, but it's really useful to consider and to open a regulatory dialogue between public sector and private sector, and to see what are the good tools and the good lessons learned from the private sector's private sector standards application in the area of food safety. So, to summarize and to close my presentation, I would say that the private standards are certainly interesting in the sense that they allow access to high-value markets, and they can provide tools for the national implementation of GAP and food safety standards in specific countries and regions. But criteria should be considered for involvement. Producers or producer groups who have the right capacity. It's no need to develop higher level standards conformity if there is no the capacity to supply adequately. Global value chain require specific quantities, good timing, and cost level. So this should be ascertained, and if there is no adequation between the capacity of production and the buyers, is no need to consider a program to promote. The RISE scheme, of course, we have seen that all these private standard schemes are in response to specific niche market and market segments, premium market segment. So the choice should be market driven, and producer groups should, or operators or associations should select the scheme depending on the target market. And as well, it's worth screening for alternative schemes and what the local or regional supply chain could require, instead of targeting immediately the highest international level. Then you should have the right setup for the operators. The soon starting base should be here. Farmers or business who have too low level of facility where the prerequisite cannot be met, is not possible to start. It's even a waste of time and effort. Then if the prerequisite program are in place, there should be a gradual build-up of conformity. It's overwhelming to target immediately at level of setting up a food safety management. And in that sense, the progressive approach recommended by local GAP and GFSI global market program are really useful. And then, of course, countries and association and governments, agricultural or trades bodies should seek to link the operators willing to adopt higher level standard, food safety standard. They should be facilitated to access to health project support, especially the ILO, the EU, the ITC, the UNIDO, the STDF, which is a VTO sponsor program, Global Environment Fund, Asia Grow, and many others. These are facilities and aid agencies that can provide support and funding to implement and develop better food safety standard, even up to the international level. So thank you very much for your attention. I have been quite long, and but still we are on time, I guess. I will handle over the speech to the host, and I hope we can take some questions either on the chat or online. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Allen. Sekarang kita masuk ke sesi diskusi ya, Bapak Ibu ya, Prof. Dedi juga.
Ya, ya.
Ini tadi ada beberapa pertanyaan di chat room. Mungkin pertama dari pertanyaan dari Pak Iwan ya, dari Arnold. Mungkin ini buat Prof. Dedi, mungkin bisa dicek.
Baik, terima kasih Mbak Widi. Sebetulnya ya ada beberapa pertanyaan buat saya. Cuma saya mengharapkan sebetulnya pertanyaan untuk tujuan ekspor ke Eropa sebetulnya lebih banyak. Jika itu ada, mungkin bagus sekali itu ditanyakan ke Mr. Allen. Ya, saya bisa jawab itu. Tapi maksudnya kesempatan ini digunakan lah untuk itu. Saya bisa jawab itu. Tapi maksudnya ada nggak pertanyaan untuk Allen? Mungkin pertanyaan terakhir ini yang mengatakan yang bahwa bagaimana ya yang EU Green Deals. Coba tanya ke Mr. Allen. Oke, itu mungkin salah satu.
Ini pertanyaan dari Pak Endro Aribowo ya, Prof. Dedi. Mungkin ini bisa saya bacakan aja ya, nanti biar translatornya juga bisa untuk mentranslate. Pertanyaan dari Bapak Endro Aribowo dari BKIPM.
Yang nomor 2, Bu. Mbak Widi, yang nomor 2-nya.
Ya, yang ini ya.
Green Deals.
Green Deal ya.
Ya, mungkin itu.
Pertanyaannya, bagaimanakah prospek posisi Indonesia untuk memenuhi tendensi ketatnya persyaratan Eropa dengan kebijakan Green Deal-nya, terutama untuk produk pangan segar yang market share ekspornya semakin menurun? Mungkin bisa direspon oleh Allen dulu ya, Prof. Dedi.
Ya, itu.
To unmute. Okay, if I understand correctly, the question is about the consequence of the Green Deal, which is a EU policy. I am right?
Yeah, Green Deal policy.
Okay, so yes. Okay, thank you. What are the prospects in the position to meet the tendency of strict EU regulation? Yeah, well, the Green Deal policy at the moment is not fully translated into additional requirement in terms of food safety.
Mungkin kembali kepada penanya, itu maksudnya seperti apa? Mungkin
ya, dari Pak Endro Aribowo, apakah ada? Mungkin tidak di ruang Zoom mungkin ya. Oh, ini ada Pak Endro.
Ya, halo Bu.
Ya, mungkin ini tadi ada Mr. Allen.
Yes,
mungkin bisa diperjelas ya pertanyaannya.
Sorry, I apologize. My battery ran off and the computer shut off. Okay, so to come back to the Green Deal very briefly, yes, there is not yet additional requirement in terms of food safety. Of course, the Green Deal reflects the increased awareness of EU consumers for sustainability and the impact on food production and consumption on the climate and on the environment. So at the moment, nothing has changed in terms of specific criteria or specific stringency, and it's unlikely to change in the near future. What we have seen, I could think of 2 areas where it is introducing new additional requirement. As you know, in the field for organic products, there is a new regulation which has been upgrading the previous one, and it has been passed in 2018, but it will become fully applicable as of January 1st, 2022. And it's very impacting for the third countries producer, because it has much higher requirements than previously. Previously, the EU organic criteria were applied more on EU producer than on third country outside producer. And now this has been harmonized, and the EU is more demanding because they want to apply equally the requirement of organic production, not only inside the EU but outside. That's one of the area. And the other area, of course, where we will see these concerns, this environmental concern reflected, will be very probably in private standards, and we can expect additional requirement and additional scrutiny in this scheme, which I have presented earlier. This will probably translate in more concern on biodiversity and animal welfare. But again, at the moment, I am not aware, and I am almost convinced that there is no additional criteria and difficulties on food safety requirement. Nevertheless, of course, Indonesian producers may prepare themselves, and especially with by supporting the sustainability and environmental efforts which have started by some NGO inside the country.
Apakah ada tambahan dari Prof. Dedi?
Yang terkait itu mungkin enggak ya. Kalau yang lain sih boleh. Tapi maksudnya kesempatan ini sebaiknya mungkin ada pengusaha barangkali yang ekspor ke EU gitu, terkait dengan private standar gitu mungkin. Ada nggak? Kesempatan maksudnya.
Iya, tadi Pak Endro seperti itu tadi ya jawaban dari Mr. Allen untuk pertanyaan nomor 2 tadi. Dari Bapak Ibu, apakah ada pertanyaan terkait ekspor EU? Mungkin di sini ada beberapa asosiasi ataupun pelaku usaha ya.
Sambil nunggu, saya bisa jawab itu pertanyaan yang terkait MRL, siapa itu ya? Mungkin ya.
Ya, baik, silakan Prof. Dedi sambil menunggu.
Tadi saya lihat ada pertanyaan bagaimana menentukan MRL, gitu ya. Untuk pestisida ya. Biasanya kita lakukan dengan supervised field residue trial gitu ya. Dicoba di field, kemudian dicek residunya. Ada kalau di OECD ada kalkulator. OECD MRL kalkulator. Nanti dari percobaan-percobaan itu dengan metode tertentu, kemudian dicek dengan kalkulator tersebut menggunakan Excel ya. Gampang sekali. Nanti dimasukkan datanya. Yang penting adalah bahwa field-nya itu sesuai, sudah mengacu kepada gap ya, dan kemudian metodenya spesifik. Nah, baru kemudian nanti ditentukan MRL. Itu yang pertama. Pertanyaan kedua tadi ada pertanyaan bagaimana menentukan MRL tadi dari ADI. Sebetulnya itu kaitannya sebetulnya dengan consumption. Kalau kita mau menghitung paparan ya, intinya kita harus menghitung berapa konsumsi dari pangannya. Kalau kaitannya dengan residu pestisida, ya pangannya mungkin horticulture mungkin contohnya. Harus spesifik pangannya, karena akan berbeda jumlah konsumsinya. Katakanlah kita mau menghitung paparan residu pestisida pada horticulture. Makanya dihitunglah dengan menggunakan metode tertentu berapa konsumsi itu per harinya. Jadi kita hitung berapa miligram atau gram per kilogram yang dikonsumsi oleh orang tersebut. Nah, kemudian nanti dihitung, residunya dihitung, kemudian nanti kalau residu sudah kita hitung, kita kan bisa menghitung paparannya. Paparannya nanti dihitung dalam satuan miligram per kilogram badan per hari. Nah, setelah dihitung, dibandingkan dengan EDI dari pestisida tersebut. Kalau misalkan di bawah, berarti masih aman. Kalau di atas, berarti sudah bermasalah. Itu yang seperti saya sampaikan tadi. Itu kalau kita kaitkan dengan EDI. Nah, itu terkait dengan MRL. Ya. Ada lagi pertanyaan tentang cacing. Ya. Kalau cacing saya kira mungkin ini kasus sudah lama. Ya. Dan saya kira BSN sudah menetapkan, bukan BSN mempunyai SNI, sarden, dan mackerel. Kan? Kemudian dijadikan wajib. Saya kira dijadikan wajib mungkin dari kementerian terkait. Ya. Bahwa cacing harus tidak ada. Nah, itu sudah peraturan di Indonesia, gitu ya. Jadi berarti harus diikuti. Nah, ada pertanyaan, apakah di Codex ada enggak? Apapun juga kalau di Codex ada tidak ada, kan Codex itu sebetulnya benchmark, ya. Bukan berarti mandatori. Kalau masing-masing anggota menganggap bahwa standar tersebut perlu direvisi, bukan direvisi maksudnya, disusun di negaranya masing-masing. Yang penting bahwa dia tidak boleh lebih longgar dari Codex biasanya. Lebih ketat boleh. Itu ada pertanyaan juga. Apakah boleh lebih ketat? Boleh. Tapi sudah tentu harus ada judgment, risk assessment, dan scientific, ya, ilmiah. Nah, itulah yang kemudian, data itulah yang nanti dibawa kalau ada dispute di WTO. Ya. Nanti akan dibahas itu, diperdebatkan. Mengapa Anda melakukan pengetatan dari standar? Harus ada alasannya. Ya mungkin berdasarkan risk assessment, berdasarkan data ilmiah bahwa negara kami harus memperketat itu. Itu kira-kira alasannya. Jadi kembali, memperketat boleh asal dengan demikian, asal scientifically based dan berdasarkan assessment. Itu Pak kira-kira jawaban saya. Terima kasih.
Baik, terima kasih Prof. Dedi untuk penjelasannya. Ini di chatroom ada pertanyaan mengenai EU dari Bapak Purnama Hadi. Mungkin ini ditujukan untuk Alain ya. Ini ada di chatroom dari Bapak Purnama Hadi.
Yes, yeah, I have seen the question and I was trying to find a way to reply. I mean, it's not easy. It's a very good question, actually. It's right. The basic food safety rule says that if there is a composition, a compound element food with animal of food origin and food of animal origin and plant and mixed, then the rule of safety should be aligned to the rule on animal for the highest level of risk. So, of course, it makes things difficult. I would say that it should be up to the competent authority of food to determine in that specific case what is the level of risk, because the person says that the fish content is very small. Okay, so the approach here would be to handle this problem is to discuss first. The food business operator should make an analysis of what is the risk, and it depends also on if the product is cooked and what is the hazard and what is the global risk level. And then perhaps the way forward is to discuss with the competent authority for food and to see that yes, this can be approved, this can be certified as LC receives the food health certificate for export, even if the fish is not is not coming from a certified facility. But again, this would be a decision to be made by the competent authority, which is providing the certificate for health certificate for export. And so the case has to be made and has to be discussed and assessed based on the risk level. Do you think it's right, Professor Dedi, to use this approach? Okay, so at the moment, this is what I can indicate. Of course, it's difficult to give a more detailed reply without knowing the detail of the product and the markets. But basically, this would be an issue for the competent authority because the person or the exporter is not dealing directly with the Directorate on Food Audit and Analysis. Is not dealing directly with the EU. So first of all, it has to be compliant with regulation of Indonesia. And so the case has to be discussed with the competent authority.
Baik, demikian Pak Purnama Hadi. Ya, itu tadi jawaban dari Mr. Allen untuk pertanyaan dari Bapak Purnama Hadi. Yes. Untuk selanjutnya, thank you Allen. Untuk selanjutnya, ini agak ini ya karena mengacu ke suatu artikel ini ya, Prof. Dedi ya, yang dari sini. Atau mungkin nanti ini bisa ini ya, mungkin Mr. Allen mesti baca dulu atau bagaimana?
Ya, nanti dicek aja. Ya, betul.
Iya, nanti mungkin dicatat dulu oleh sekret ya, oleh sekretariat RISE Plus terkait pertanyaan dari Ibu atau Bapak Nirafi Faras. Baik, ini sepertinya ya sudah ya yang pertanyaan hari ini. Tadi yang untuk Prof. Didi.
Saya mau sarankan ya, Mbak Didi. Ya. Kan tanggal 23 ada pertemuan. Itu kaitannya juga dengan export refusal ya, penolakan ekspor di Eropa, dimanapun juga gitu ya. Itu kesempatan juga untuk bertanya mengapa terjadi penolakan ekspor. Ya. Jadi nanti mungkin pada mereka-mereka yang mau datang, terutama dari sektor eksportir, sudah menyiapkan mungkin kasus-kasus yang terjadi. Kalau saya bisa menyarankan, sebetulnya penolakan itu kan harus dipandang sebagai challenges ya pada pelaku ekonomi tersebut ya, tantangan gitu ya. Kenapa terjadi refusal? Saya melakukan penelitian dengan mahasiswa saya untuk mengkaji mengapa ditolak. Ya. Katakanlah hasil perikanan. Kami bisa melakukan suatu namanya risk ranking, ranking risiko, kemudian risk prioritization, prioritasi risiko gitu ya. Setelah dikaji, kemudian ketahuan mengapa penyebabnya dan ditelusuri gitu ya. Apa risk factor yang menyebabkan export refusal tersebut gitu ya. Nah, dari sana kemudian ditelusuri ke pelaku usaha. Kami melakukan survei ke mereka apa yang dilakukan dari proses-proses yang ada dan bisa menentukan di mana letaknya masalah tersebut gitu ya. Dan kemudian kami melakukan kajian menguji kadar katakanlah salmonella untuk menentukan food safety objektif dari produknya dalam rangka untuk menyiapkan eksportasi tersebut. Jadi saya menganggap bahwa kalau ada export refusal dikajilah dulu gitu ya. Terus jangan kemudian persyaratannya ketat gitu. Tapi yang itu kan tantangan gitu ya. Apakah kita bisa menghadapi tantangan itu atau seperti apa gitu. Ini yang saya sarankan. Jadi mungkin kebersamaan industri ya untuk melakukan kajian itu yang penting. Jadi kita melakukan risk ranking. Risk ranking itu kan bisa health risk, bisa economic risk gitu ya. Meranking economic risk-nya, kemudian kita membuat prioritasi mana yang diekspor, ke mana diekspor. Itu kira-kira saran saya. Jadi tolong kalau ada masalah tersebut dipikirkan solusinya dulu oleh kita gitu ya. Nanti baru kalau ada penolakan, mengapa di sana diperketat dan sebagainya. Nah, itu kesempatannya tanggal 23 saya kira ya. Itu terkait dengan ekspor juga. Itu saran saya. Terima kasih.
Baik, terima kasih Prof. Dedi. Nanti kita akan coba sampaikan juga di grup-grup WA terkait ya. Kalau untuk tanggal 23 apabila ada case mengenai ini bisa didiskusikan seperti itu. Baik, ini untuk pertanyaan tadi sudah semua juga ya yang untuk Prof. Dedi ya sudah direspon. Mbak Siti ini apakah akan kita close atau yang pertanyaan kemarin masih ada beberapa?
Mungkin bisa diinformasikan Mbak Mita untuk pertanyaan yang kemarin.
Ya, baik. Ini kemarin masih ada sedikit pertanyaan ya Bapak Ibu terkait ada yang belum terrespon. Ini terkait, ini kemarin ada dari Bu Syarifah ya, mengenai peraturan dan persyaratan. Sudah terlihat Pak?
Sudah terlihat.
Ya, yang kemarin nomor 6 ya, nomor 6 terkait peraturan dan persyaratan terkait food ini memerlukan kos atau biaya yang tidak sedikit. Seperti itu, apakah ada respon atau solusi untuk hal tersebut? Ini dari Bu Syarifah dari PT Solusi Market Indoraya.
Ini soal sertifikasinya ya, sebetulnya dia itu saya nggak bisa jawab, itu mungkin yang solusi itu kan mendapatkan sertifikasi dengan mungkin dengan biaya batas gitu, saya nggak tahu. Mungkin sekarang kan kalau tidak salah ada program-program UMKM khusus gitu ya. Ya mungkin BSN juga ada gitu ya, Badan POM juga ada. Mungkin dicari informasi aja ke situ ya. Dalam rangka juga Undang-Undang Cipta Kerja juga. Mungkin kesempatan sekarang untuk menghubungi lembaga terkait. Badan POM pasti ada UMKM program, BSN juga ada. Mungkin terkait dengan sertifikasi mungkin BSN lebih pas ya. Oke. Itu mungkin jawaban saya.
Ya, baik Pak. Terima kasih. Ini selanjutnya ada dari Balai Besar Pasca Panen terkait keamanan pangan jamur merang ini Pak.
Nah itu dia. Jamur merang memang kan harus ada sterilisasi di awal-awalnya kan. Karena jamur merang kan medianya juga media macam-macam, ada kotoran ayam macam-macam gitu ya. Jadi itu persyaratan awal memang harus diikuti gitu ya kalau kita mau terhindar dari patogen, terutama patogen gitu ya. Nah saya nggak tahu nih apa yang diinginkan sebetulnya dari petani ini. Apakah praktek-prakteknya? Saya kira training-training mengenai jamur merang sudah banyak gitu ya. Dan pasti sudah juga diberikan arahan-arahan bagaimana cara menghindari patogen. Karena harus ada sterilisasi dari media. Itu jawaban saya. Jadi upayanya memang harus dihindari itu. Ya.
Baik, demikian dari jawaban dari Prof. Dedi. Nah selanjutnya ini mungkin untuk Mr. Allen ya terkait ya ekspor tadi ya Prof. Dedi ya yang nomor 8 ini. Jadi jika ingin melakukan ekspor ke Eropa sebaiknya ke negara mana, dan negara Eropa yang apa ya mungkin yang barrier atau paling sulit dan yang mungkin lebih sedikit persyaratannya itu kira-kira di mana, mungkin seperti itu ya.
Ya silakan ya betul.
Yes, yes, thank you. I think we discussed this yesterday, but I can have a few words here. Basically, the goal of building the EU law, food law, and EU official control was to make sure that the food safety regulation and arrangements and criteria would be the same in each and every country of the EU. And that we have also, the country don't come in the EU like overnight. For example, we have a pre-accession program which has been implemented for over the last 20 years. And the country first cooperate more closely with the EU. And we have what we call harmonization. And we transfer harmonization consists for this country. For example, the last one was Estonia or Lithuania, or no, Lithuania is not member. Estonia and or Albania or this country like this, which are more recent. First, they cooperate, and we transpose the acquis communautaire, means all the set of law of the EU, we transpose in their national legislation. And we also build the capacity of competent authorities to how to operate, how to implement the food safety regulation. So once this is done, after 5, 6, 7 years, they access to the status of full member, and when they access, all their systems are at the level of the EU. So it means that when a country is part of the EU, the systems, the official controls work in the same way in all the countries. There will be no weak or stronger or easier countries to export or to land the products. So this is one. And secondly, now, I mean, in terms of pure logistics, if you are shipping goods by boat, they are likely to arrive in Rotterdam because this is the main port of call. Maybe Hamburg or maybe Marseille, if you target the southern countries. But there are very few landing. I mean, in terms of international logistics, it's all coming at the same place. So basically, in short, there will be no difference in food safety application of food safety regulation wherever your product is arriving.
Oke. Terima kasih, Mr. Allen. Lalu yang nomor 2 ini tadi seperti yang tadi sepertinya ya, Prof. Dedi ya,
tadi ya.
Kita kerja, betul. Ya.
Saya kira berhubungan dengan itu aja, BSN atau Badan POM terkait dengan startup.
Iya, betul Pak. Kan sudah ada pendampingan untuk UKM. Selanjutnya ini yang terakhir mengenai food safety implementation. Apakah ada definisi terkait food safety di EU terkait religion, belief, atau culture seperti itu, Mr. Allen?
Yes, no, sorry. It's okay? I am on? Yes. Okay. No, there is no specific implementation in regard related to religion, belief, or culture. This is not, but of course, EU has different countries, and we have Catholics, we have Jews, we have Muslims, we have countries with different minorities and majorities as well. So, in terms of food safety, there is no difference. I think the hazards are the same, whatever the religion you have and whatever the culture you have. For salmonella, it doesn't make any difference. But to be more practical in my reply, there are differentiation and different schemes to recognize the particular aspects of culture or social or habit in food. But they are not linked to food safety. Therefore, they are not regulated. They are regulated to some extent under different vehicles. We have the laws on geographic indication products. We have the laws on protected appellation products. And this is mostly what we have in terms of protecting the cultural food and the heritage of certain countries in Europe. But this does not relate to food safety.
Untuk sesi hari ini bisa ditutup berarti ya, Mbak Siti. Untuk pertanyaan semua sudah direspon oleh para expert.
Ya, Mbak Mita, kayaknya sudah bisa ditutup untuk sesi hari ini dan mengingat waktu juga sudah menunjukkan sebentar lagi jam 16.30. Oke.
Siap, terima kasih Mbak Siti. Terima kasih untuk workshop hari ini dari Mr. Allen dan Profesor Dedi. Materinya luar biasa dan banyak diskusi juga dari teman-teman peserta. Karsten, apakah ada yang ingin ditambahkan?
No, I've been listening to these discussions, and I have one single comment based on my experience from Indonesia, and it is that I see a clear tendency that if you want to export to Europe, I've been involved in shellfish, and I'm going to work also with some fish areas. Then basically, the way you shall organize yourself, both in the company, in the private part of the value chain, but also with regard to control and so on, carried out by the public, it shall be more or less, it shall more or less live up to the EU regulation. And it's a hard one. We are going to carry out an assessment later on in the implementation of Arise Plus of a port. And earlier it was so that the fish plant, or the processing plants, they should just be approved. Now it's not enough with an approval of the establishment. We shall also go upstream and check whether the fish are handled correctly in accordance with the EU rules when they come up out of the. It means that they shall immediately be put on ice and so on. So suddenly the government in Indonesia cannot any longer approve establishments themselves. It has been put on standby. So in that way, there is a clear tendency that things, export to Europe becomes more and more complicated. It was the same with shellfish, where we made an assessment to find out whether it was possible to export a live shellfish to Europe. Basically, perhaps the private company we visited, they could live up to the requirements, but the control carried out by the public was not sufficient at all. So it is uphill, it is complicated, and that's the reason why we are here, to give you advice and also to share with you the knowledge we have in these fields. This is all I would like to say. Just to confirm, yes, it is when you have fresh products, it is demanding. It is difficult to export to Europe. This is my final words and for today, and I'm looking forward to see you again next week on the 23rd for the third and last workshop. Thank you very much.
Baik, terima kasih Karsten. Untuk hari ini workshop sudah selesai. Terima kasih untuk kehadiran Bapak dan Ibu. Sampai jumpa lagi tanggal 23 untuk sesi terakhir, lebih banyak mengenai EU regulation dan access market to EU. Jadi mungkin bila ada case-case tertentu bisa didiskusikan di tanggal 23. Terima kasih Bapak dan Ibu. Mohon maaf untuk kekurangan acara ini. Izin saya tutup. Selamat sore. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih Mbak Mita. Terima kasih Prof. Thank you Karsten. Thank you
Thank you very much. See you again.
Terima kasih.